From Mexican mezcal and Indian desert salt, to Ghanaian cocoa and Portuguese sardines, in 2022, we took you behind the scenes of some of the world's biggest industries. Our first stop is Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History hides 99% of its collection behind security. The Smithsonian Museum of Natural History has over 147 million specimens, the largest collection in the world. Everything from giant dinosaur bones to delicate butterflies to pickled animals like this stonefish.
Most venomous in the world. Whoops.
But less than 1% of it's on display. The rest is tucked away in what's called collections, hidden behind the scenes.
All right, so this is our vault area, our secure storage area for the mineral collection.
It costs more than $100 million to run the museum, and it's mostly funded with taxpayer dollars. So why does the US government spend so much money on things most Americans will never see? Well, the specimens aren't just sitting here gathering dust. They're actively used for research, with big impact.
This is what caused the airplane to land in the Hudson River.
But flooding could endanger it all. We went inside the secret collections in Washington, D.C. to see how they acquire, clean, maintain, and protect millions of specimens. This is how much of the Museum of Natural History you can see. But the hidden collections make up the rest of the space, more than 1.4 million square feet, spread across the museum and the off-site support center. There are 7 different departments, from entomology to paleobiology, and the collections are constantly growing. Visiting the museum is free to the public because it's government funded through tax dollars. But researchers here can't use tax money to acquire new objects. So how do they get them? Well, they're either collected in the field, donated, or purchased with endowments. For example, this giant Arkansas crystal was donated to Mineral Sciences in 2021. We don't know exactly how much it cost, but estimates put it in the millions. Over in entomology, scientists collect half of the new insects in the field and get the other half from donations.
As people retire and they're looking for permanent homes for their collections, those often come to us. These are the tailless whip scorpions, so anybody who watched Harry Potter would recognize these. They're actually really docile, they're easy to handle. You can actually get these as pets.
But getting dinosaur bones is much harder.
So here's some of the dinosaur material.
Paleontologist Hans Seuss is up against a growing market of private collectors.
Started after those awful Jurassic Park movies when everybody decided to have a dinosaur in their living room. People now think that if they find a toe bone, they should get enormous amounts of money for it.
And since they have to rely on endowments, museums can't compete at million-dollar auctions.
Often commercially collected fossils have no detailed locality information, and that makes them scientifically almost worthless.
So all Hans can collect are bones he finds on federal lands, or smaller ones he can purchase with donations. But some collections at the museum are just really old. Today, bird researchers rarely collect specimens in the wild.
This bird was collected in 1904.
And if they do, it's from healthy bird populations.
Today we take tissues, we take song recordings, we keep skeletons, we make spread wings. So we have a lot more parts of the bird that we save. And it's our ethical responsibility to do as much as we can with the specimen if we're going to take it from the wild for research.
Once a specimen is purchased or collected in the field, it's transported to the museum. Specimens like that giant crystal then go through a process called accessioning.
Is where the museum inspects the objects so they can take ownership of it, make sure that it's in good shape when we receive it here at the museum.
The museum acquires 300,000 specimens a year to reflect the scale and the diversity of the natural world. Once the museum accepts an object, it has to get cleaned. Out at the museum support center, any recently living creatures are cleaned using beetles that really like to munch on dry skin.
They're a little bit more free-roaming in the larger chamber. There's nothing really containing them except for trays.
You don't want rotting flesh in storage.
We currently have a sea turtle, elephant, dolphin skulls, and I believe there's a wallaby in there.
Cleaning dinosaur bones takes even more work.
We'd be lucky if all we had to do was just dust them off. They're encased in their host rock, which is what we call matrix. And that matrix has to be removed little by little, bit by bit.
Michelle uses this machine, called an air scrape. It blasts compressed air at the rock. But how do they prepare something to be stored forever? Well, a dinosaur bone can't just sit on a shelf exposed. Over time, gravity would start to break it down. So most bones get a custom storage cradle, built out of fiberglass and plaster. It's basically a fancy Tempur-Pedic. Each costs about $800. They're pest and water resistant. Hans wants them to last because he loves his fossils.
I'm kind of a wallflower, but you tell people that you're a paleontologist at the Smithsonian and you're suddenly the center of attention.
On the other side of the museum, some of the older animals got stuffed.
Squirrel.
And some get pickled.
When you pickle a whole organism, you can study not just their fur and their skeleton, but their internal anatomy and all that kind of stuff.
Everything from a polar bear embryo to bats to giant fish are stored in alcohol. These fish come from all over the world.
So see, these do not fit in jars, and the cheesecloth is to keep them from drying out if the level gets low. So the coelacanth, they thought it was extinct, and in 1938, it was discovered in South Africa. It was a very big deal, as you can imagine.
Over in entomology, the insects get dried and pinned, so they're temperature stable. Then Floyd and his team put them into these hydraulic carriages.
We have 35 million specimens in the collection. We have over 400,000 species represented in our collection, which is more than all the other departments combined. Since insects are essentially our only major competitor for food, and because they have such a profound impact on human health.
Each of these storage techniques is designed to last indefinitely. But while the researchers have done all they can to safeguard these precious objects, it's unclear how much longer they'll be able to do that. The National Mall was once a marsh, and today it sits in the floodplain of the Potomac River.
We're literally at sea level here. So one thing I've been doing is this year moving all collections out of the basement of this building up to higher floors.
As the climate's changing, flooding from heavier rainstorms and the Potomac are a growing threat.
Water seeping into basements along the mall and threatening the treasures of the nation. The Smithsonian will tell Congress tomorrow it's $1 billion behind in needed repairs.
It's already happened to the museum next door, leading to millions in damage. And the Natural History Museum is next. But Congress has been slow moving to fund improvements.
So we're going to have to start armoring the mall with larger and larger dikes.
The museum does plan to expand the off-site support center. It's farther above sea level, so researchers have started moving more specimens out there. For now, to preserve its collections on the National Mall, the museum has begun creating digital scans, starting with easier-to-handle objects like plants and flowers.
All of our flowering plants have been digitized so far. That is about 3 million plant specimens that we have run on this conveyor belt.
Today, this digital archive has over 9 million specimens, but the museum is still years away from getting the entire collection online. So why put in so much effort to store things most people will never see? Well, for research.
So think of a museum not just as a place that displays stuff, but a place that studies and understands stuff as well.
The collections are essentially a living library that 12,000 visiting scientists can access. And their work has real-world benefits. In mineral sciences, scientists across the globe can ask Jeff for a piece of any of his rocks for research.
This is our reference mineral collection. So this is the part of the collection that gets used primarily for scientific research.
The department also monitors and tracks volcanic activity around the world. Pickled mammals are studied to find out which species can transmit diseases.
One of the ways we study those diseases is to find the mammal host for the virus.
Whenever a bird strikes a plane in the U.S., samples of it are sent to Carla Dove in vertebrate zoology.
The colors and the color patterns on some of these birds is just amazing.
Yes, her last name is Dove.
Yeah, I get that all the time. My name is very appropriate. Okay, so I'm just coming from the mail room where I picked up the Daily Mail. These packages all have specimens of bird remains or some kind of wildlife remains. that were scraped off of aircraft.
And Carla gets 10,000 of these packages a year.
This is a part of the horizontal stabilizer, what the bird hit and caused the damage to. And you can see all of this bird ick on here, which is what we refer to as snarge, or bird tissue.
Bird strikes cost the airline industry billions in delays and damages. Remember the 2009 crash landing in New York City?
Less than a minute into the flight, the pilot reported a double bird strike.
In that case, we got 69 bags. Because as they went through and did the investigation, they went all the way into the engine and they wanted to know how far into the engine the feathers went.
Her team then uses these mailed-in bird remains to identify the species involved in the strikes.
This one here, do you know what this might be, Carla?
It looks kind of like a black vulture.
There you go. That's one of her favorite birds. No, chicken is her favorite bird.
If she can't identify a sample right away, Carla can compare its feathers to one of the 500,000 specimens in the museum's collection.
The location of this strike was Florida. So we look at all of the possible herons in Florida and we match it up perfectly with an American bittern. And this piece of beak just so happens to fit perfectly with the beak of the specimen.
Aeronautical companies use Carla's data to develop planes that can withstand bird strikes.
If you know what the species of birds are that cause these problems, you can go out onto the airfields and do habitat management to keep those birds from wanting to come in to these environments.
And based on her research, Air Force units have adjusted flight trainings,
thereby reducing the risk of bird strikes, but also, we like to say, saving birds too.
But we've barely scratched the surface of the museum's countless research initiatives.
We're collecting specimens so that scientists 50 years from now or 100 years from now will have access to the same diversity we have right now.
And we may never know how important these collections may be for scientists in the future.
Museums are the memory of our culture, and they're the memory of our planet. And imagine the Smithsonian of the year 2400. It'll have specimens from this time that will be a distant memory to the people then, but it will tell the story of planet Earth.
This is the oldest fish cannery still in operation in the world. Ramirez packs 60 million cans of fish a year, from tuna and mackerel to sardines, its biggest seller, and a staple here in Portugal. There were once 400 canneries like this one, packing sardines up and down Portugal's coast.
Maybe 80% or more that went away, and today we have, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 companies in Portugal.
That's Manuel. His great-great-grandfather started the company nearly 200 years ago. And the staff also spans generations.
Eu trabalho aqui há 30 anos já. Esta é a Cristina, é minha filha, trabalha aqui também.
But keeping Ramirez going hasn't been easy. It's faced a revolution and declining fish populations. So how has it survived? And how does the company plan to keep going? We went to Portugal for a closer look into the big business of canned fish. Ramirez hauls in its catch from private fishermen in the bustling Matzoh harbor.
Começamos a comprar sardinha em junho, julho.
But with warming ocean temperatures, sardine populations have dropped by more than 80%. It got so bad that in 2004, regulators banned fishing during the spring spawning season. In the years that followed, the government shortened the entire fishing season to just 6 months and set a fishing quota. Last year, fishermen caught only 30,000 tons. Compare that to the 1980s, when they hauled in over 100,000 tons a year. It's caused recent sardine prices to double. During the season, the fish arrive fresh at the factory and go directly to get cleaned.
We know that the good quality of sardine, for example, is the summertime. And during this time, we intensify the activity to do as much as possible.
But to keep producing year-round when fishing's banned, Ramirez introduced this freezing system in 2015. First, the fish go into a brine for 30 minutes, and then into the freezer, held at about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Fatima's in charge of quality control and food safety.
E se tivéssemos só sardinha, teríamos capacidade para cerca de 200,000 toneladas de sardinha.
They'll remain in the freezer for up to 6 months, but Fatima says it doesn't affect the fish much because sardines are naturally so fatty. At 4 p.m., workers pull the fish out of the freezer so they can defrost overnight.
Cerca das 7 da manhã, as primeiras pessoas a chegar retiram as paletes da sardinha.
From here on out, the defrosted fish go through the same machines as the fresh ones. It removes the head and cuts off the tail.
Temos que ter sardinhas grandes, bem gordas, para que a camisa saia de forma fácil, sem estragar a sardinha.
This used to all be done by hand, but this machine has tripled the speed of guts removal.
Mas pelo menos uma vez por dia vem uma empresa que retira tudo o que são as vísceras, as cabeças, para fazer comida para animal.
But some of the products, like the fillets, are too delicate for the machines. Workers on these specialty lines still hand-cut them, using century-old techniques.
Depois as senhoras vão pondo dentro das latas.
Once packed, they add on a lid and group them into batches.
E depois sim, vão para o cozedor.
They get cooked for 30 minutes, first in hot steam and then dry heat. Once done, the workers add in other natural ingredients, like spicy sauce, peppers, or carrots. Next, the cans get weighed. Then this machine splashes in a bit of either water, tomato sauce, or olive oil.
Depois entra numa máquina que se chama cravadeira, leva ao tampo e é fechada.
The cans drop into baskets in this pool of recycled rainwater. Workers then push the cans into this sterilizing machine to kill off any bacteria on the outside.
É aí sim que nos vai a longevidade da conserva.
In theory, one can of fish could last for more than a decade. It was actually a French guy who invented canning in the early 1800s, when Napoleon put out a call for a way to feed his army. And the method took off in popularity. With its long stretch of coastline and abundance of fish, Portugal was primed to get in on the market. And in 1853, Manuel's great-great-grandfather opened the world's first fish cannery in Vila Real de Santo Antonio. By the 1920s, there were hundreds of competing factories along the coast, and during World War II, there was room for all of them. Portugal was neutral, so it exported cans to both sides.
Some cans were found at the bunker of Hitler. Some of them were Portuguese and were from our company.
And in 1940, the founder's grandson opened up a new factory, where it is now, in Matosinhos. By then, the sardine had become a cultural icon. But after World War II, the industry started declining.
We had a revolution in 1974, and lots of companies had no freezing area. They had tough times, of course, so no frozen possibilities.
Climate change and overfishing were also big contributors to the decline. By 2013, there were only 20 canneries left. So how did Ramirez stay afloat? First, because of its loyal staff, spanning generations. Ramirez runs an on-site daycare, and many of its current employees graduated from it.
Eu trabalho aqui há 30 anos já. Esta é a Cristina, é minha filha. Tinha 3 meses de idade quando veio para a creche.
O meu pai está na parte da manutenção e o meu marido que também é na parte da manutenção. O dia que tenha filhos, trarei para a creche porque é uma mais-valia.
The second reason?
Gosto muito especial pela inovação.
The original cans opened with a key and were often made of tin, which rusted more easily. So Manuel's grandfather switched to aluminum cans in the 70s.
We developed, together with our can supplier, easy open way of opening a can of sardines or tuna.
Along with the freezing system, fish cutting, and seaming machines, Ramirez also added this finishing line.
O primeiro é a colocação de inkjet, o do lote, da validade e da identificação do próprio produtor. Depois sim, passa por uma máquina de raio-x, no sentido de ver se tem corpos estranhos.
Quality Lab pulls nearly 100 sample cans throughout the day. They test for pH levels and check that seaming and sterilization were done right.
Há muitas mais máquinas, há linhas robóticas novas e tenho mais espaço para trabalhar também.
All these machines have tripled the company's production speed, from 100,000 cans every day in 2015 to 300,000 cans per day now. Finally, to stay competitive when sardine populations dropped, Ramirez added new products: tuna salad, mackerel, salmon, and codfish.
So this difficulty became, an opportunity to do other very interesting products.
Today, the company sells 70 different products and has introduced an online shopping platform.
We export almost to 50 countries, spread all over the world.
E depois tem sempre três características, é pronto a comer, tem uma validade muito grande, é fácil de transportar.
While sardine populations could fall again, Manuel doesn't seem worried.
You have been here for almost 2 centuries, so I think we will overcome.
The inner core of an agave plant, also called a piña, is what makes mezcal. It's a liquor like tequila, but distillers cook the piñas for 5 days underground in handcrafted ovens like this one.
Entre todos están observando cómo arman ese rompecabezas, ¿no?
Some of the people who make mezcal in Mexico have been doing it the same way for centuries. And now more people than ever want to drink it. Mezcal's value increased by 50% in 2021, making it the fastest growing spirit in America. Now, the US market for mezcal is bigger than Mexico's. But even as international popularity grows, some producers are getting squeezed out of the industry. And some can't even call their spirit mezcal anymore. Getting a certification can take up to a year and cost thousands of dollars, and producers say it's getting in the way of long-held traditions. So some, like Graciela Angeles Carreño, now label their bottles distilled agave.
Si mezcal es lo que yo hoy día veo que es, no me interesa llamarme mezcal, porque cualquier payaso puede hacer mezcal.
We head to Oaxaca, Mexico to see how master mezcaleros harvest, cook, ferment, and distill agave. While mezcal and tequila are both made from agave plants, mezcal actually predates tequila and has a distinct smoky flavor. Mezcal gets its name from the Aztec word mexcali, meaning agave roasted in the oven, but it's nicknamed the elixir of the gods. Because, as the legend goes, in pre-Columbian Mexico, a lightning bolt hit an agave plant, creating mezcal. For most of mezcal's history, it was a drink of the lower class.
Que era una bebida de pobres, de campesinos, de gente no educada.
Graciela's family has made mezcal in the town of Santa Catarina, Minas since 1898. But unlike her ancestors, she grows her agave, or maguey as it's known locally, from seeds.
Es como un cascabel. Y así es como aparecen las semillas.
While other companies may prefer root cuttings to speed up the process, Graciela uses this slower method so the agave can stand up better to diseases.
Son plantas de un ciclo largo y que solo podemos aprovechar una vez en su vida.
After anywhere from 7 to 35 years, the agave is ready to be harvested, all by hand.
Quizás los expertos lo hacen como en unos 15 minutos. ¿Sale, Goyo? Al ataque.
First, they remove the leaves. Then they slice off the thorns on the tip and side of each leaf. Because if those thorns accidentally get under your skin, Graciela's brother says they can migrate, which hurts a lot.
Acá, en esta parte de acá tengo muchas enterradas. Se cree en la época prehispánica que esto usaban para un tema de castigo a ladrones.
Saponins, the chemicals agave leaves excrete, can also be dangerous.
Genera ardor, dolor, o en la piel pues comezón y te genera granos.
But Edgar says the saponins don't bother him.
Yo soy moreno. A las personas de piel blanca les hace más daño que a los morenos. Es la ventaja de ser moreno.
What's left is the agave heart, called the piña, and it takes a ton of effort to unearth it.
Se regresa uno bien cansado, lleno de ronchas, espinado.
Piñas can weigh hundreds of pounds. So workers break them up to make it easier to carry, then haul them onto an awaiting truck bed. But it's still weeks away from becoming mezcal. Remember that earthen oven? Well, the agave hearts first have to get cooked.
Cuando se cocine va a ser muy dulce.
Building the oven is an art form passed down for generations. Workers place stones on top of firewood. The rocks are exposed to a 2,000-degree fire for up to 9 hours, so they get red hot.
Posteriormente pusimos sobre esas piedras calientes fibra de agave o guarape, ¿no? Que es el resultado de la destilación, es el desecho del proceso. Eso se humedece y se hace una capa que es como un aislante para evitar que el maguey toque directamente la piedra, porque si la toca, se quema.
They load the agave hearts on top, big ones first and small ones to follow. They kick and shove each piña into place.
Entre todos están observando cómo arman ese rompecabezas, ¿no?
Next, they shovel more fiber waste on top. Then 2 men toss a canvas over the whole thing. And finally, a layer of soil finishes up the oven, trapping the heat inside.
Cuando ya tuvimos casi toda la tierra arriba, Edgar puso agua y vieron que salió con una potencia como si fuera un volcán. Si tú no acomodas bien el maguey, cuando se pone el agua, se te desbarata, se cae toda la tierra.
A cross is placed on top to bless the batch.
Ahí, en el horno va a permanecer por 5 días.
What's inside the oven smolders slowly, giving mezcal its distinct smoky flavor. For the next step, we head to another distillery called Tres Mezquites, an hour east in San Baltasar Gualavila. Here, Don Goyo has been making mezcal for 40 years. Today, his business pumps out 6,000 liters a year.
Siempre le echo 2 copas por la mañana antes del desayuno.
He and his team move the cooked agave hearts into this molino, or grinder. To crush the agave, a horse pulls this stone, which weighs a whopping 1,000 pounds.
El caballo se llama Satanás. Porque, bueno, ahorita pues el caballo es mansito pues porque él tiene 22 años que está trabajando. Si no más antes, cuando era joven, el caballo está bien arizo. No se deja que otra gente le toca. Lo único el que me deja pues yo soy.
Don Goyo's team uses pitchforks to move the crushed agave fibers into fermentation tanks. Back at Graciela's, they add water to dissolve the sugar. Naturally occurring yeast gets to work eating the sugar and converting it into alcohol. After it ferments for nearly a week, Edgar comes in to check on it.
Entonces hay que levantar primero esto. Ahorita van a salir unos mosquitos que le llamamos mosquitos borrachos. Son nuestros amigos. Les gusta estar entre el alcohol.
He first listens to make sure there's no sound of escaping CO2 bubbles coming from the vat, which could sound something like this.
Ritmo de la fermentación. Si es muy lento, casi está. Y si casi es nulo, ya está listo.
Then he submerges his tester tube.
Se llama probador, es un carrizo que tiene un orificio. Tiene que saber a cerveza, sí, cerveza fuerte, como una cerveza negra, como una amarga, sí, pero con alcohol, pues, ¿no? No, todavía les va a faltar mucho. Hoy es día miércoles. Yo le calculo que entre el sábado y domingo lo estaríamos destilando.
When it's ready to be distilled, workers rake the fibers into the stills and add more water. From each barrel, they get about 100 liters of mezcal. The distilling area is known as the palenque. As the agave fibers heat up, the alcohol vapor rises. It travels through this tube, condenses, and drops into an awaiting jug. They'll distill it a second time to get 4 jugs. The first is called the head, and its alcohol content is really high. The next jug is known as the body and has a little less alcohol. The third is the tail, with even less.
Y lo que envasamos como mezcal es el cuerpo. La cola actualmente la utilizamos para enjuagar nuestras botellas.
And finally, the last jug is an acidic residue called enguiche, used to clean the floors. Graciela's team fills 8,000 bottles a year. She sells her brand Real Minero within Mexico and exports it to the US and Europe. But it wasn't until the 2010s that mezcal began seeing interest outside Oaxaca. It popped up in trendy bars in the US and beyond. In response, Mexico's mezcal production jumped 400% in the 6 years leading up to 2020. By then, the US overtook Mexico as the biggest market for mezcal. What was once a poor man's drink had reached global fame.
Y es una carrera que no paró ni siquiera en la pandemia, ¿no? Porque en la pandemia pareciera ser que en vez de bajar, aumentó.
To standardize and regulate the growing industry, the Mexican government got involved. It started in 1994, when the government established a denominación de origen for mezcal, kind of like how champagne can only come from a specific region in France. It was to protect the traditional process of making mezcal and the place where it's made.
Es algo que es muy bueno desde el punto de vista que el consumidor va a tener una certeza de que es un producto que va respaldado.
In 1997, the government appointed an organization now called Comarcam to oversee and enforce the rules for certification. Rules like mezcal had to be made from 100% agave in only these 9 states, and it had to have a certain amount of alcohol by volume and methanol. The DO seems like a great idea to guarantee quality standards across Mexico and keep production inside the country. And at first, even mezcal producers advocated for it. Those new regulations eventually came with a catch. Today, to get certified, producers now have to have time and a lot of money. Mexican lawyer Blanca Salvador says certification can cost anywhere from $375 to $2,500, which is a lot for a small mezcalero like Don Goyo. And the costs don't stop there. Producers have to pay to get their mezcal lab tested and buy all the required equipment.
Entonces no tienen a veces el recurso para eso. Entonces si no lo tienen, no van a pasar la prueba de lo que es la certificación.
And the whole certification process can take over a year.
¿Y qué pasa si nos negaron la marca? Perdimos 6 u 8 meses en poder tener una marca, y si no tenemos una marca, no podemos nosotros vender el mezcal.
For years, going through Comarcam was the only way to get a certification. In 2020, claims of corruption came to light, and the Mexican government fined the organization nearly $50,000 for deceptive and abusive practices, like prioritizing big mezcal companies over small ones. But now, producers fear the DO rules are putting traditions at risk. For one, it's really hard to get a consistent alcohol and methanol content in traditional distilling. So a few large-scale producers have turned to more modern equipment, like steel stills, to guarantee alcohol and methanol. Another concern? Changing name standards for agave, despite generations of indigenous groups using native words for the plant. When Comarcam told Graciela to drop the ancestral name of Quiche on her labels for Mexicano, it was her last straw. So in 2021, she and her family decided to stop certifying their brand, even though their distillation process didn't change.
Porque se vuelve un tema burocrático, un tema político. Entonces, no nos gustó, por eso nos salimos.
Choosing family tradition over regulation, Graciela labeled everything distilled agave.
No dice mezcal, pero es un mezcal.
And other distilleries followed suit. But there's another problem. All that demand has drawn interest from international companies. It's created more competition on top of an already tough certification process. Of these popular brands, none are Mexican-owned. A French company owns Del Maguey, a British company owns Casamigos, and a New York-based company funded El Silencio Mezcal. Even celebrities like George Clooney, Adam Levine, and the stars of Breaking Bad have gotten in on the market. Because of the DO's protection, American companies can't make mezcal in the US. But they are allowed to buy loads of it from Mexican producers, repackage, and resell it for a lot more than what they paid. This system has left traditional producers, even certified ones like Don Goyo, with a dwindling piece of the booming global industry.
No tengo marca porque, bueno, falta de ¿cómo se llaman? Del dinero, pues, para ponerle marca.
So he sells his mezcal in label-less plastic bottles to a middleman. Don Goyo earns $15 to $40 per bottle. Casa Cortez, one of the brands that eventually buys Don Goyo's mezcal, resells it for $38 to $100 a bottle.
Compran menos y después ellos lo duplican, pues.
But these ancestral mezcaleros haven't given up hope in their craft.
Lo primero que desearía es que los mezcaleros logremos entender que la palabra no le pertenece solo a algunos, que es una palabra que nos pertenece a todos los mexicanos.
Nowadays, the government has added more certifying agencies to lighten the load of Comarcam. But Blanca thinks it should do more to help producers bottle their own mezcal and streamline the certification process.
Debe, desde mi punto de vista, agilizar los trámites para poderle permitir a los productores pequeños estar en la posibilidad de competir a nivel internacional.
On Graciela's side, she believes the key lies in respecting the agave plant itself.
Me encantaría que todos los que producen mezcal en este país comiencen a realizar acciones para conservar el maguey. Porque si no hay maguey, no hay mezcal. ¿Y entonces de qué sirve el éxito?
Mezcaleros also hope to keep putting tradition first.
Ahora sí que testigos de pues, la intensa lucha que se ha desarrollado para preservar, para conservar, ahora sí que la industria artesanal.
A tradition you can see here. Before taking a sip of a new bottle, Don Goyo pours a bit out, thanking the land for its ancient gift of mezcal.
Entonces, bendiciones para todos los mezcaleros, para todos los maguilleros y para todos los campesinos en general, que pues entregan día a día pues cada gota de sudor, cada esfuerzo que ahora sí que con mucha pasión y entrega pues hacen a que esta industria pequeña pero importante pues sea posible.
An estimated 90% of India's ceramic products come from the state of Gujarat. But the industry has struggled in recent years. First, companies started replacing workers with machines, leaving many ceramicists without jobs. Then, weakened demand forced many of those factories to pause production or shut down completely. This company has stayed afloat, but it hasn't been easy.
आज 56 years के बाद भी मैं कम से कम 12 से 15 घंटे तक काम करता हूँ.
To keep potters working, owner Matzoh Prajapati combined traditional handmade techniques with machinery. Then he set out to tackle a big problem. Many of his customers don't have regular access to electricity. So Matzoh designed appliances completely out of clay, like refrigerators and pressure cookers that don't need power. And they had to be cheap.
उसकी वजह से मैंने ये काम किया कि बिना बिजली का फ्रिज में कैसे बनाऊं. 3 से 4 साल तक इसके पीछे काम किया, 2001 से 2004 तक.
So far, his strategies have been a success. The company tripled its product portfolio in a decade and set itself apart in a region that's been famous for ceramics for centuries. We visited the Mitti Kool factory in Gujarat, India, to find out how Matzoh and his team produce thousands of pieces of ceramic cookware every day. Matzoh's family has made ceramics for generations, but it's only in the last 10 years that he's made a living from it. That's thanks to a sweet spot between machine-made and handmade. It all starts with the clay. It's sourced domestically within India or melted from old ceramics. This machine does the melting. It's called a boil mill.
1000 किलो मिट्टी और 500 किलो पानी. ये इसके अंदर डाल के हम इसको 12 घंटे तक इसको घुमाते हैं.
After 12 hours, they get a liquid clay. It needs to be thickened with dry powdered ceramic.
जैसे कि इसमें आप देख रहे हैं जो पका हुआ बॉयल मिल में से मिट्टी और पानी दोनों मिक्स हो गया है, 12 घंटे चल गया है, ग्राइंडिंग हो गया है. उसको हमने ये वाइब्रेटिंग चालना के अंदर डाल दिया है, जिसमें से निकल के ये कुएं में पानी जाएगा.
It's then churned with what's called a plunger to stop the clay from settling.
ये ब्लंजर के माध्यम से ये लिक्विड को घुमा रहे हैं, मतलब मिट्टी को घुमा रहे हैं. ये नीचे बैठने नहीं देते क्योंकि मिट्टी और पानी जुदा भी नहीं होना चाहिए. ये हमारी मेन प्रोसेस है.
Once it's time to use the clay, it's pumped into this big metal container. Workers pour in natural dye for a uniform color.
आधा घंटा के बाद ये लिक्विड को हम वापस निकाल लेंगे, क्योंकि ये निकालने के बाद जितनी थिकनेस रहेगी वही हमारा कप होगा, ग्लास होगा, मोल्ड होगा या
To make a pressure cooker, they mold it using a hydraulic press.
तो इसको 1000 डिग्री में ये कुकर को हमने बेक किया है, पकाया है.
Workers finish it off using this machine called an electric chalk.
जितना फिनिशिंग अच्छा हो, इतनी क्वालिटी अच्छी दिखेगी.
But to make pots, artisans use this wheel. Much of this work is still done the way it's always been done, by hand. They carefully join the top and bottom pieces of the pot together. It takes a lot of skill, but an experienced artisan can finish a piece in minutes. Once an item is properly molded, it goes into a rolling kiln. Kilns like this have always been used to cook ceramics, but they used to be dangerous.
पहले के ज़माने में कचरे से हम किलन पकाते थे, तो इसकी धुआं की वजह से हमारा फेफसा है, वो सब खराब हो जाते थे.
Some kilns burned plastics and old tires too. It was so unhealthy, many ceramicists died young.
मेरा दादा भी 4 भाई थे, एक भी भाई 50 इयर्स पूरा जीवंत नहीं रहे.
But Mansukh Bhai's kiln is different.
इसके बदले हमने ऐसी टेक्नोलॉजी किया कि कोई भी जगह पे धुआं भी ना हो और उसको हेल्थ को कोई भी प्रकार की नुकसान ना हो.
And it cooks the clay at the perfect temperature.
और किचनवेयर प्रोडक्ट में इसमें घर में यूज़ करने के लिए कम से कम 900 से 1000 डिग्री तक उसको बेक मतलब पकाना पड़ता है.
Too little heat and the ceramic won't harden. Too much heat and it'll crack. 6 hours later, the items have hardened fully.
किलन में से ये हमारी जो आइटम है उसको हम पहले यहाँ रखते हैं, रैंक में रखते हैं. रैंक में आने के बाद हमारे यहाँ सब टेक्नीशियन आदमी इसको चेक करते हैं, उसको हम धोने के बाद हम पैकिंग करते हैं.
While Mansukh Bhai's ceramics still have handmade parts, that hasn't been the case for most Indian companies in years. Starting in the mid-90s, industrialization swept Gujarat's ceramic industry. Machines took over most of the production process, and it left most artisans like Mansukh Bhai's father without work.
हमारा जो बाप दादा है वो भी यही काम करते थे, लेकिन ये काम में बहुत ही मेहनत थी और मेहनत के बदले पैसा इतना नहीं मिलता था.
But Mansukh Bhai believed he could do better than his predecessors. 20 years ago, after reading about one of India's most devastating earthquakes, Mansukh Bhai shifted gears to focus on solving a huge problem.
और इसमें हेडिंग में लिखा था कि गरीबों का फ्रिज टूट गया. तो मेरे दिमाग में एक आइडिया आया कि भाई सही में गरीबों का एक स्वप्न होता है कि हमारे घर में फ्रिज है तो अच्छा है.
It took 4 years to finalize the design for the Mitti Cool refrigerator. It can keep perishable food cool for up to a week, and it never needs electricity.
क्योंकि इलेक्ट्रिक फ्रिज हमने देखा था तो इसमें तो लाइट की वजह से ठंडा होता है, लेकिन हमें जितना ठंडा चाहिए था उतना ठंडा नहीं होते थे.
Mansukh Bhai's fridge cost $40, about 1/3 the price of an electric one.
नया प्रोडक्ट मिला और उसको भी सबको ऐसा लगा कि भाई ये गरीबों का फ्रिज नहीं है, ये तो अच्छी हेल्थ के लिए मतलब अच्छा पर्यावरण देख के आपने बनाया है. तो गरीबों से ज़्यादा अमीर लोगों ने भी लिया.
Because of the fridge sales, Mitti Cool's production is picking up, while hundreds of other ceramic companies in the area paused production. In the past year, online sales have jumped, and the company employs 150 people, mostly women. Mansukh Bhai tripled his current portfolio of 350 products to include handmade tiles, exterior products, and murals.
मैं डेली का 25,000 मतलब 25,000 पीस प्रोडक्शन करता हूँ और वो पूरा इंडिया में और आउट ऑफ इंडिया में भी जा रहा है. तो मेन फ़ायदा ये है कि 25,000 पीस पर डे कोई न कोई घर में जाता है. और मैं नहीं हूँ, अभी तो 10,000 फैमिली भी है, तो ये सब ये काम करते हैं.
The world's most expensive spice comes from this flower, and it takes about 150,000 of them to make just 1 kilo of saffron, a kilo that costs $3,000. Here in Kashmir, saffron is an important part of the economy and cultural identity. It has many uses, including
religious purposes, for pharmacological purposes, for culinary, as a spice, as a mood enhancer.
But Kashmir's saffron industry is facing a crisis. In recent years, farms hit with drought and rising temperatures have lost 65% of their normal yields.
खेत पे हम देखते थे कि पूरा कवर्ड होता था सैफरन से, ठीक है, आज खाली खाली सा ज़मीन पड़ा है.
And the supply chain is riddled with imitation saffron.
Gardenia flower or safflower is being sold as saffron, corn silk or tissue paper, plastics, but that is not saffron at all.
The Indian government launched initiatives to try and help, but the farmers we spoke to say they haven't been enough. All of this combined has left farmers frustrated and driven some out of the industry. We went to Kashmir to see if there's a future for the region's red gold. Saffron comes from these 3 tiny strands, called stigmas, found in this purple flower, the Crocus sativus. The crocus can only be grown in a handful of locations. Kashmir is one of the only places in India with the right conditions to grow saffron, and farmers have grown it here for 3,500 years.
Spice तो ये बिल्कुल इसके मुकाबले में कोई spice नहीं है.
That's Ashik. His family's been growing crocus flowers here for nearly a century.
और ये बीज अंदर से है तो ये अभी उसमें है कि हमें दूर से पता चलता है कि यहाँ पे बीज है इसका सैफरन, ठीक है, फिर जो है फूल इस बीज में से आता है.
Once planted, the flowers need about 2 years to mature before they can produce good saffron. Come October, Ashik heads out to hand harvest the delicate purple flowers. Almost everyone helping is related to him. Since the flowers don't bloom all at once, just 5 years ago, Ashik could harvest for an entire month. But his crop is shrinking. This year, with fewer flowers, the harvest ended in just 6 days.
इससे पहले हम जाते थे 10 बार 15 बार, मतलब उतनी, मतलब मैं कह रहा हूँ 5-6 साल पहले, ठीक है, अब ज़्यादा अब कम हो रहा है.
Ashik's farm is not unique. He's getting hit with the same climate and political issues affecting the entire region.
Climate change is definitely having an effect.
The temperature, earlier it used to be a bit cold this time around the season when the saffron harvest would take place. But now it's very warm, so that has affected saffron badly.
Saffron needs cold soil to grow, yet Kashmir's temperature has risen by 1.45 degrees Celsius in the last 20 years.
And the rains, we had very few rains in the last, I think, 4 or 5 years.
When the rains do come, they're more intense. In 2014, heavy flooding washed away the saffron crop, and saffron farmers are still reeling from the severe drought in 2018 that dried out the soil.
ये क्वालिटी में उतना ज़्यादा इम्पैक्ट ही नहीं पड़ता है, बट क्वांटिटी में इम्पैक्ट पड़ता है, और टाइम पे बारिश न होने की वजह से प्रोडक्टिविटी कम हो जाती है.
Then there are the political issues. Kashmir is a disputed region between India and Pakistan, but India administers the part where saffron grows. In 2019, the Indian government implemented an internet and communication blackout. That, coupled with the pandemic lockdowns the following year, caused saffron farmers and the supply chain to suffer. Over the past decade, saffron production was so low, the government launched the National Saffron Mission. The goal of the $53 million mission was to revive the saffron crop. It promised to rejuvenate saffron bulbs and build irrigation systems to fight drought. But many farmers say the mission hasn't helped as promised.
बहुत सारे पैसे खर्च हो गए, मिलियंस खर्च हो गए, ठीक है. आई थिंक जितना मेरा एक्सपीरियंस है रिगार्डिंग सैफरन की, वो सब फेल हो गए.
Of the 124 wells the National Saffron Mission promised to dig, the government says 121 were installed. Ashik's farm got one of those wells, but he says it never worked.
उन्होंने दिया था कि सैफरन मिशन बिल्कुल लगाया हुआ है, जिस दिन से लगाया हुआ है तब से ऐसे ही पड़ा है. ये आप देखिए ना, मतलब जब से लगाया तब से यहीं पे है, ऐसे ही है, कोई ये नहीं है.
And farmers had to pay for these irrigation systems.
5,000 रुपये मैं त्रो मान से मैं आशि तकरीबन 2.5 लाख रुपये यमन निश कमन निश एग्रीकल्चर वालें निश मोन 2.5 लाख रुपये मैं त्रो अगर जमीन 30 कनालन में 3 पर 15 गो सोद 2.5 लाख रुपये मोन ना दिवान इरिगेशन वनकसन आब तो ना दिवान तम पोस वापस.
Suhail, who works on the Saffron Mission, says that's because when the government tried to install irrigation systems,
we faced stern resistance from certain farmers because they felt if we cut open the soil, it would somehow deplete the quality of saffron.
The mission claims saffron production has rebounded.
This would not have been possible if National Mission on Saffron would not have been there.
But these farmers aren't experiencing the production growth the government is reporting.
आज खाली खाली सा ज़मीन पड़ा है.
Yet Ashik has continued his family's saffron tradition. In the evenings after harvesting,
सारी फैमिली एक साथ बैठ के ये रेड स्टिग्मा जिसको हम रेड गोल्ड कहते हैं इसका जो है वो निकालते हैं.
The stigmas are fragile, so they have to be removed by hand.
ये मेरे पापा है, अभी हम यही कर रहे हैं, ये ऑर्डर आया है, 200-250 ग्राम का ऑर्डर आया है, तो अभी हम वही बना रहे हैं.
Then the stigma's less valuable yellow tips are cut off.
ये जो प्रोसेस है, इसमें से वो जो लवर पार्ट है वो रेड स्टिग्मा का वो बाहर निकलता है, वो ये आगे गिर जाता है, ठीक है, और रेड स्टिग्मा इसी में पड़ जाता है.
The red stigma houses the characteristic compounds that give saffron its bitter taste and aroma. Once it's dried, the saffron can be packaged up. It takes Ashik and his dad 2.5 hours to process enough saffron for just this tiny container. The amount of work required contributes to the spice's high price.
फार्मर ब्रोकर को बेचता है, ब्रोकर जो है वो फर्म को बेचता है, राइट, और फर्म है कि उनके पास रजिस्ट्रेशन होती है, वो ऑल ओवर इंडिया बेच सकते हैं.
15 years ago, Ashik's family could make $4,000 for its yearly saffron harvest. Today, Ashik brings in just about $900 a season. Once it hits the market, Kashmiri saffron faces another problem: fake saffron.
What is sold in the name of saffron is illegally dyed corn silk or tissue paper, plastics, which are not fit for human consumption and made to look identical to saffron.
Counterfeiters have also turned to safflower to pass off as saffron, but the plant has a completely different taste. Because of saffron's high price, counterfeiters can make a hefty chunk of change.
A layman cannot differentiate visually.
A source of much of the misleading products is Iran, which produces 90% of the world's saffron.
People may use pure Kashmir saffron adulterated with maybe Iranian saffron, which comes to a very cheap rates to India.
Iranian saffron can cost 48% less than Kashmir's, which is considered more aromatic and nutritious.
Overall, it's bad for the whole saffron industry and especially for the Kashmir saffron farmers that their name gets tarnished.
To help raise prices, 2 years ago, the government's saffron mission created this trading center called the Saffron Park.
We are the guardians or custodians of the GI of Kashmir saffron.
The Saffron Park's main goal was to help identify and stop fake saffron. Instead of selling on the open market, farmers could now drop off their saffron harvest at the center for storing and authentication.
We do not accept saffron in dried form in this trade center. We only accept fresh flowers to be brought to the collection center so that we ensure that the flowers are grown in the fields and saffron farms of Kashmir.
In the lab, scientists can test to make sure the saffron is real. They first do a water test.
Threads of saffron are put into water or milk. It should give very slowly release a yellow color and not an instant coloring of red or orange color. And that is a purity test for saffron.
But they also use machines to look for levels of saffron's characteristic compounds. If it's proven fake, it's thrown out. And if it's real saffron, it gets packaged up with a GI tag.
Geographic Indication Certificate. Saffron of India is the only saffron in the world who has been given this certificate.
Just like champagne only comes from a specific part of France.
And GI tagged saffron should be taken as an authentic, pure Kashmiri saffron.
The center then markets the saffron and sells it online through its new auction site.
Every saffron bottle is traceable to the farmer and his land. It has been a very successful model of e-auction that we have tried.
Muzamil says saffron that would normally sell for $1,300 on the open market can sell for $3,000 through the center.
It is 2.5 times what they used to get. Then they have a channel. They don't have any middlemen. They just grow it and then sell it off and go back to their homes with their money.
Suhail said the center has been a success and works with 35% of Kashmir's saffron farmers, or about 6,000 families.
We are doing good. I'm damn sure we are building on their trust. We are giving them economic stability. We are giving them a better value of their produce.
But not everyone's convinced. Bashik said he doesn't trust giving his crop to a center. The industry's woes have driven some farmers in Kashmir to leave the saffron business altogether.
काम को छोड़ के दूसरे काम को पकड़ना पड़ा है.
6,000 families have left the saffron industry. Reports say many have shifted to apple and almond growing.
हम उस चीज़ से बाहर आएंगे, ठीक है ना? तब जाके हम यही कह रहे हैं कि हमारा इंटरेस्ट जो है इस चीज़ से ख़त्म हो चुका है.
The National Saffron Mission hopes to turn things around.
We have had major setbacks. We are fighting it. There should be acknowledgement of our efforts. If everything goes well, 2 to 3 years, this mission would be done and dusted.
Because ultimately, the goal among farmers and the government is the same: to save Kashmiri saffron.
This is a cultural identity of Kashmir and especially the people of Pampur. I feel very proud, to be a part of the area which grows saffron. But the thing is that, the production is declining. It really disheartens me.
Everything is at stake as far as this crop we grow is concerned. We cannot let go of our heritage.
Every cheesecake squirted out of this machine costs twice as much to make than it did a few years ago. Juniors pumps out, bakes, and packages 5 million cheesecakes a year. And the company has used the same recipe since the 1950s. But it's gotten a lot harder. First, there was a cream cheese shortage.
You can't make cheesecake without cream cheese. It's impossible.
And now, inflation has caused the prices of other ingredients to soar.
I've been doing this for 33 years, and I've never seen a time like this, ever. And I can venture to say if my father was alive, he never saw a time like this either.
Now that he's taken over, Alan expects a tough work ethic out of all of his employees.
This sandwich is not great, Nas. Am I wrong?
Third-generation owner Alan Rosen takes us behind the scenes.
It's like watching a baby being born, to me.
To see how Juniors keeps rolling out its famous cheesecakes in the face of shrinking margins. Here in New York City, Juniors is an institution, but its cheesecakes aren't actually made in the city anymore. In 2015, the company moved to this New Jersey plant.
When we took over this building, because we didn't have the space to do it out of Queens.
240 workers whip up millions of cheesecakes and layer cakes here every year. Not surprisingly, every batch starts with the most important ingredient.
This year we'll probably go through about 7 million pounds of cream cheese.
Juniors partners with Kraft Heinz, the maker of Philadelphia cream cheese. Workers unwrap each of those giant blocks of cream cheese and tip them into the mixing bowl.
So far we have cream cheese, we have sugar, we have eggs. Still to come, we have some heavy cream, some vanilla, and I think that's just about it. It's kind of simple.
Workers roll these giant mixing bowls over to the assembly line. To speed up production, Alan added automatic depositors.
It gets pumped up here into here. This is going to meter out exactly the right amount.
First, workers drop a slice of vanilla cake, not graham cracker crust, into each pan.
We use cake on the bottom because this is a recipe that my grandfather created in 1950. It's a lot of work just to make the bottoms.
Slowly, the pump works its way through the entire batch of batter, plopping perfect dollops into each pan. Then this guy knocks out any excess air. On this line, they're making strawberry swirl cheesecake. The swirl used to be piped by hand, but this robot took over the gig in 2017. Next, the cakes head to baking, but this step also has a unique twist.
A lot of bakeries use rack ovens where you just slide the whole rack in and slide the whole rack out. It doesn't work for our cheesecake.
His team bakes the dense cakes in a water bath.
Spreads the heat evenly. The bottoms of the cakes don't burn. They rise up like a souffle. You can see how the cakes are literally above the pan.
When they're golden brown, workers pull out the trays and pour out leftover water. Then, they test the internal temperature.
They take temperatures for food safety, but I can see with my eyes.
After they've rested, the cakes aren't jiggly anymore.
We don't do jiggly, we do juniors.
Using this repurposed pizza oven, bakers can heat the pans just enough to release the settled cakes.
After the cheesecakes get depanned, we bring them into our blast freezer.
Alan keeps it at a balmy 0 degrees inside. But it's not just plain or swirl cheesecakes in this freezer. The company whips up dozens of different flavors of cheesecakes, layer cakes, and desserts. The chocolate mousse cheesecake is hit with a heaping pile of mousse, doused in a waterfall of chocolate and covered in mini chocolate chips. There's also the pumpkin layer cake cheesecake, robots and bakers work together to ice it. Leftover cake tops are ground up to make the crumb that goes around the edges. All the finished and chilled cakes converge on the packaging line, from the pumpkin cheesecake to the 24 mini cheesecake variety pack bound for Costco. Workers place each cake in a box, slap on a label, and put it in an even bigger box. That all heads to the freezer a second time. This will all be gone within 30 days.
Right now it's enough space, but I can see maybe next year us needing even more space. This is going around the whole country.
Most of the 6-inch cheesecakes end up in one of the 12,000 supermarkets supplied by Juniors.
From Wegmans to Kroger, Publix, Stop and Shop, ShopRite.
Alan's grandfather, Harry Rosen, opened up the first Juniors location on Election Day in 1950.
He said, if we're going to be a great restaurant in New York, we have to have great cheesecake. Some people venture to guess that my grandfather named it after his two sons, Walter and Marvin, my father, my uncle, but Jews don't really do the junior thing, so that's a little out the window.
Over the next few decades, Junior's popularity soared. It wasn't long before celebrities and politicians were digging into these iconic slices.
We started a mail order business late 80s, okay, before food by mail was a thing, and people were calling from Florida and California. Then in 1995 we met QVC. They were doing a search for America's best products state by state. We went on and I think we sold 2,400 cheesecakes in like 6 or 7 minutes.
Today, Juniors has 4 restaurants in the New York area, a quick service at LaGuardia Airport, a direct-to-consumer business, and a booming retail presence.
Oh, we're definitely the biggest cheesecake company in New York. So the top seller in our restaurants is either strawberry cheesecake or New York-style cheesecake.
Visitors from all over the world stop in for a slice.
Yeah, my name is Marvin. I'm from Germany. Brownie explosion cheesecake. I think it's like a full meal.
But keeping up with all this demand for cheesecake hasn't been easy, even for a giant like Juniors. In 2020, the pandemic shut down all of the restaurants.
I sort of joked with my mom that thankfully my dad was deceased before COVID, because COVID would have killed him, not the disease, but the fact that his restaurants, his babies, were not doing what they were supposed to do for, in some cases, 14 or 19 months.
At the time, the company's direct-to-consumer sales actually doubled. But then came the great cream cheese shortage of 2021.
Last year we started to, we heard about it, and then all of a sudden Jason calls me and says, there's no cream cheese. I'm like, what do you mean there's no cream cheese? You can't make cheesecake without cream cheese.
A cyber attack hit a cream cheese factory in Wisconsin. It wasn't Philadelphia's facility, but Kraft faced spiking demand and supply chain issues of its own. The company struggled to get a hold of starch thickeners and packaging materials. Without any cream cheese, Alan had to shut down the factory, and the team missed a couple of big orders.
And a couple of orders for us are trailers full, about 70,000 pounds, so it's a big deal. I was sweating it out pretty good.
By early 2022, Kraft had restored cream cheese supplies to Juniors.
So we are one of the biggest users of cream cheese in the country.
Just in time for inflation to hit.
Every ingredient is up right now, from eggs to sugar, heavy cream, but cream cheese is definitely the highest priced ingredient that we use right now.
Alan says the price Juniors pays for cream cheese more than doubled, from $1.50 a pound to over $3.
It's the demand, it's based off of the butter markets, and dairy prices are just very high right now, and that's why it's affecting the price of cream cheese.
Everything is up. Labor obviously is up.
Junior sales have bounced back to pre-pandemic levels, with $110 million in expected sales this year.
But costs have escalated so dramatically that profits in the restaurant business and the wholesale business are way down.
Alan said profit margins dropped by 6%.
Oh, it's brutal. No, there's no doubt. It is the hardest time in I've been doing this for 33 years, and I've never seen a time like this, ever.
So Alan made the decision to raise prices.
Our product cost has literally doubled for cheesecake. Doubled. We can't double our prices. That's impossible.
But Alan says higher retail prices haven't stopped customers.
No, not at all. I've had their cheesecake hundreds of times over many years, believe it or not, from when I was a kid.
Restaurants kind of around where we're from ordered this cheesecake to be shipped to Oklahoma City.
But even if food costs continue to rise, Alan says he'll never touch the recipe.
You know, we had to move people around and reschedule, but we're not changing any recipes here. That's never happening. We'd sooner not make cake. Listen, we have a 72-year history of making cheesecake the exact way we're doing it, exactly the same way forever. We're not changing that.
So how does he plan to stay afloat? One, with those robots. And then with new products, from cheesecake shakes to updated cake flavors, like this strawberry Christmas cheesecake.
Oh my God, that is so good.
And finally, Alan says diversifying helped him weather the storms of recent years. Of course, Junior's has the restaurants, but what it makes from supermarket sales is quickly catching up.
I would say it's about 50-50. The restaurants drive about half the volume of the company, and this drives about half the volume of the company. I think the fact that we are diversified is what saved us.
But is this business sustainable if food prices keep increasing?
You know what? The tell will be in the next 3 months. I think it's sustainable because I'm a big believer in our business and how good we are at it, and that people are always going to want a cheesecake.
This slimy glob of yeast and bacteria ferments to make kombucha. And where there's fermentation, there's alcohol. Anywhere from 1 to 3% alcohol by volume can occur naturally in raw kombucha. That's less than a light beer.
You would be in the bathroom having a mini cleanse before you could actually end up intoxicated.
They'd have to drink 10 bottles.
But U.S. law requires ABV never go over 0.5% for kombucha to be sold as a soft drink. If they do go over, producers could face tax penalties or risk getting their bottles pulled from shelves, which has happened before. So producers have two choices: get an alcohol license to ferment kombucha naturally, or redo the entire product so it doesn't create as much alcohol, which is what GT Dave, kombucha's first billionaire, did. Either way, dealing with the boozy byproduct is expensive and complicated, and some say may eliminate what makes kombucha a healthy drink. This congressman is trying to pass an act that would raise the legal limit of alcohol for just kombucha to 1.25%. But can it pass? We went to Oregon for a deeper look at how one brewer works within these regulations to produce over 30 million bottles a year. Here at Brew Doctor in Portland, Oregon, the kombucha starts with 3 main ingredients: water, tea, and sugar. It's the same 3 ingredients that have made up the drink since its likely creation, in China, thousands of years ago. In Japan, it was made with seaweed, hence its name, Kombucha. These days, brewers start the tea with botanicals, like rose, mint, and lavender.
It's fun with these botanicals to think about the giant fields they come from.
A single batch of kombucha needs about 85 pounds of tea to get it going. That'll make 66,000 bottles.
In here, what we do is we bring in hot water.
Then they add sugar.
So essentially what we're doing here is making a big pot of sweet tea that will then get fermented into kombucha.
Steeping takes around 40 minutes. Then it's pumped through this waterfall filter.
And all the organic material comes out. And so we partner with our local municipalities to compost.
To ready the vat for the next batch of tea, this guy crawls in to clean it out. And that already brewed sweet tea heads to tanks in the fermentation room, where the tea first starts to produce alcohol. At 500,000 gallons total, all the liquid in here would almost fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The room is kept at a steamy 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and it smells kind of sour.
And that seems to be where our kombucha fermentation is happiest. So we add the sweet tea into the tank where there's already a SCOBY.
A SCOBY is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Essentially, it's a living organism that kickstarts the fermentation process.
As the kombucha is fermenting, the SCOBY forms in layers. Eventually, you'll just have layer upon layer upon layer upon layer.
It's this guy's job to pop CO2 bubbles that form at the top of the tank. The SCOBY's bacteria eats up the sugar and creates carbon dioxide, which makes kombucha bubbly, and alcohol. As long as it has sugar to feed on, a SCOBY can grow to epic proportions.
If this tank were as wide as a swimming pool, it would create a SCOBY the width of a swimming pool. This batch has been fermenting for just over 3 weeks.
At this point, Brew Doctor's kombucha has about 3% alcohol by volume. Compare that to a light beer, which sits at 4.2 ABV.
Dude, it's so good with alcohol in it.
No.
Cheers.
Every fermented food, from yogurt to kimchi, has trace amounts of alcohol.
You can't feed yeast sugar and not create ethanol. That's natural.
Brew Doctor pays annually for a distillery license. But because Brew Doctor sells its kombucha as a soft drink, the team has to remove most of the natural alcohol, bringing it from 3% to under the legal limit of 0.5%. They use this machine, common in the wine industry. This column is heated slowly at low temperatures. Cones spin inside to spread out the liquid. A cool vapor evaporates, carrying the small alcohol molecules with it.
It's a very elegant, mechanical way of taking ethanol out of a liquid without affecting the nature of the liquid.
That fancy machine cost Matt $1 million.
But now we're responsibly selling a non-alcoholic product to our consumers.
Testing is also required by law, but it's another complicated and expensive step in the process. This alcohol testing machine can cost up to $40,000. Each bottle gets a label warning of the trace amounts of alcohol. At this point, the alcohol is well under the 0.5% limit. Next, it's packed and shipped. But kombucha will continue fermenting once it leaves here. And if it's stored improperly at a grocery store,
alcohol that's naturally present due to the fermentation would continue to increase.
If you drink spoiled milk, is that something you take up with the producers? It's something you take up with the store? So there's a couple of questions there in terms of who really is liable at that point.
The current law says producers are to blame if ABV ever goes over 0.5% before it winds up in a customer's fridge, which is exactly what happened in 2010. At the time, there weren't a lot of eyes on the fledgling kombucha industry. But then a bottle of kombucha in a Maine Whole Foods started bubbling. State authorities tested it for alcohol and found it to be 2.5% ABV, way above the legal limit. It still wasn't enough to get an adult buzzed, but that bubbling bottle upended the industry.
Everybody kind of found out about alcohol in kombucha.
Whole Foods dropped all kombucha from their shelves.
Virtually every kombucha maker in the entire country was asked to temporarily cease production.
Kombucha was going up, it got pulled off the shelf, it dropped like this, and it just created this sort of wound that we've been trying to heal from ever since.
Brands scrambled to get their kombucha under compliance.
Some brands just didn't come back.
Honest Tea and Vibrance stopped producing kombucha altogether.
It was close to catastrophic. Being off the shelf for 3 months can almost kill any brand.
Others, like Brew Doctor, dropped a lot of money on alcohol removal machines. Others use kombucha from concentrate and dilute it with water or juice.
Some brands chose to pasteurize.
But some argue removing the alcohol can also erase some of the drink's health benefits.
They would also remove the organic acids and the beneficial microorganisms that make kombucha probiotic.
To keep his drink raw but still compliant,
we took the original recipe and we got it licensed as an alcoholic beverage.
Then GT created a whole new recipe.
We modified the temperature that we fermented the kombucha, the length of time that we fermented the kombucha.
So the alcohol content was lower. The 0.5% ABV rule is from a Prohibition-era tax code.
So what we're dealing with is an antiquated law that isn't based in the laws of nature.
If a product is at 0.4 versus 0.6, that's not the difference between you getting drunk or intoxicated. It's really just a legal technicality.
The companies that made it work, despite the regulations, have thrived in an industry that has bounced back. GT became kombucha's first billionaire.
We have over 50% of the market share.
But producers and government leaders are pushing back on 0.5%. In 2021, Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon introduced the Kombucha Act to Congress. Its goal? To increase the alcohol limit for only kombucha to 1.25%.
It's a natural process where you're simply not able to regiment it in a way that keeps under that 0.5%.
This new limit is not unheard of. Canada's kombucha is allowed to contain 1.1% alcohol, and Australia's 1.15%.
They're forced to make their product according to the tax code, not what their customers want to drink.
It would also allow kombucha to be closer to its original form, ethanol and all.
They have to decide if they want to make kombucha the way it's always been made, for a couple thousand years, and have an alcohol content, or if they're going to use a solution like ours where they can get the alcohol out.
The act would also allow more wiggle room for kombucha to naturally keep fermenting on store shelves.
I anticipate that the industry is going to explode once the act passes.
But will the Kombucha Act pass? Well, the House denied it once before. And now that Matt already has his distillery license, even he is on the fence.
I don't see that happening. There's a lot of instances where that's irresponsible to serve something with that alcohol content. Don't want my kids drinking something that's 1.5% alcohol.
I'm really confident that we're going to see it pass. People write laws, people get laws changed.
What I don't want, which could happen if things don't change, is these industries shut down. And all you have is a seltzer that says kombucha on the label, which would not be good for anyone.
Americans are buying more plants than ever before. In 2020, sales for potted foliage plants were up 23%. And a year later, the plant-growing industry was worth $16 billion. What's behind the growing interest in things that grow? Whoa! Thousands of social media influencers sharing their collections and touting the health benefits of houseplants. Influencers like Summer.
Come on in. I personally bought the plant for $39, which was pretty expensive at the time. Now you get a small plant like this for hundreds and hundreds of dollars.
But nearly half of all the houseplants grown in the US die at some point along the supply chain.
I've gone to many big box stores, and those plants are in sad condition.
These are living products, after all.
We can't just flick a switch. We're not making soda pop bottles. We're not producing toilet paper.
And new plant parents make terrible caretakers. They kill another half of the plants they take home, according to one study. So as demand increases, so does the amount of waste the houseplant industry creates.
It'd be as much as 7 or 8 years to produce a plant.
Think about all of the input that had to go into that plant and to just have it thrown out the door.
So why do so many plants die in the supply chain? And what are growers and plant influencers doing about it? We went to one of America's largest farms to find out. Costa Farm, here in Miami, produces 1.6 million plants every week. The company supplies giant retailers like Home Depot, Walmart, IKEA, and Whole Foods. This is Mike. He's the production manager.
We're here at our soil processing plant. This is the beginning of the growing cycle.
Mike makes a living keeping plants healthy.
That's the main goal, to keep it alive.
But at this scale, that's not always easy. Costa has to maintain the perfect ratio of light, water, temperature, and food.
We can only deal with the natural factors.
Every grower will lose some plants along the way. That's what the industry calls shrinkage. But Costa has taken steps to minimize it. It all starts with this potting mix. Costa uses coconut coir, which comes from the fibrous middle part of the fruit.
Nosotros recibimos el coco de la India, casi todo viene de Sri Lanka.
This is a more sustainable alternative than peat moss, which releases carbon dioxide when harvested and takes a long time to grow back.
We're just talking about millimeters or fractions of millimeters of growth a year.
After the coconut coir arrives at Costa, these machines rehydrate it. It's then ground and mixed with wood fibers. This machine drops the soil mixture and fertilizer into pots. Workers gently flatten the soil by hand to get an even spread. Costa says this recipe gives plants the best chance of survival until they reach store shelves. Next, the pots head over to the production area to get their young plants. These are cuttings taken from the stems of more mature plants. These workers place the cuttings into pots. They're fragile, so they have to move fast.
La idea es que la planta no sufra estrés. Mientras más rápido sea el proceso, es mejor. Tenemos menos pérdida en el campo.
During this process, growers nationally lose an average of 20% of their plants, although Costa says it loses half that. Another reason plants die? Disease and pests. The biggest concern are spider mites and mealybugs.
They're sucking the juices out of it. The leaf is not able to get the proper nutrition.
Workers inspect every plant. If they spot any spider mites, they fire up this fancy gun, which is actually a repurposed leaf blower. The dust that comes out is full of bigger, predatory mites.
Lo que vamos a hacer ahora es soltar estos depredadores, que son un insecto beneficioso para nuestras plantas.
Predatory mites don't hurt the plants or people, but instead feed on the dangerous spider mites. They're also a safer alternative to pesticides. Afterwards, this giant sprinkler moves through to water them.
This plant now will spend its life cycle growing here.
Costa then hardens off some of its plants to avoid any more shrinkage. That means towards the end of the growth cycle, growers starve the plants of humidity, light, and water. The goal? To mimic conditions indoors.
And then that plant will toughen up and we'll feel like we have more of a green thumb because we'll have been able to care for that plant better.
The plants then get one more inspection. One worker places plants on the belt, another inspects the quality, removing any dead leaves. If they notice any wilting, the plants will be removed, and Costa will try and revive them. But on average, another 10% of plants perish during production in the US. Costa trucks its plants to retailers all over North America. Some are sold online. But the shrinkage continues in the store. It's estimated about 10% of plants don't make it out.
The big box stores, they don't tend to have horticulturists on staff. They just have people that may or may not water things.
I don't know about you, but I've gone to many big box stores and those plants are in sad condition.
Think wilted or yellowing leaves or rotted roots.
We go and we look at the tomatoes and the bananas and everything. We look for bruises. Is it really ripe enough? And so we need to look at plants even more that way.
But the biggest plant murderers are consumers.
You haven't grown a plant unless you killed it 3 times.
One survey found new gardeners kill 70% of their plants. Even experienced ones kill about a third of what they grow.
That's where we make our money, but hey, let's not say that, right? So folks, when they get plants, they tend to love them so much, they may over care for them, and they may not be so successful.
So out of 10 houseplants, only 3 will survive a significant amount of time in a customer's home. When everyone was stuck inside during the pandemic, more people turned to plants for their health benefits. And there's actually science to back that up. Researchers found that having plants in hospitals can speed up recovery time for patients, reduce their anxiety levels, and elevate their moods.
The presence of plants does things like decrease blood pressure, decrease heart rate, increase endorphins, all the things that make you feel better.
Plus, they're pretty. Exotic plants went viral on social media. Today on TikTok, there are over 4 billion views on videos with the hashtag #PlantTikTok. Social media influencers like Summer have made a living off sharing their collections and plant care tips.
You can make something look really good with photography and with lighting, and people all of a sudden may feel the need to have that plant.
And it's driving sales at just unprecedented levels.
And that's driven up prices.
We saw some people reselling the plants on social media for like $1,500 each.
The demand has put a squeeze on producers like Costa.
How has Costa Farms kept up with it?
We haven't.
We have also grown our portfolio to include different varieties of plants.
But starting a new line of plants, like this Aglaonema, could take up to 8 years. And trends change fast. Through the hardening process, pest control, and quality checks, growers like Costa are working to minimize shrinkage. Costa says its shrinkage is half the national average. But as consumers buy more, there's a lot of waste, from the lost plants to the growing number of plastic pots, peat, water, and space across the supply chain.
You wouldn't typically think that houseplants is an extractive industry. But in many cases, it actually is an extractive industry.
But there are ways consumers and producers can be more green. Consumers can get clippings from friends and learn how to take care of the plants they've already purchased.
And we understand how our pets function. We have to do the same with the plants. We have to figure out what exactly it is that they need. So we learn not to overwater plants. Most of the time, you don't need a lot of fertilizer.
Linda would like to see all growers swap peat moss for renewable potting mixtures, like the coconut coir Costa uses.
They can always compost the plants and recycle the pots.
But if consumers are having a hard time keeping plants alive, they should ask one simple question.
Do you really need that plant?
Ghana is the world's second biggest producer of cocoa, but the country only earns about 2% of the $100 billion industry. Cocoa growers here export most of their cocoa beans to Europe and North America, where they're turned into chocolate.
We are shipping out the cocoa in its raw state. And if you look at the value chain of cocoa, money is made in the finished product.
While big chocolate companies rake in billions a year, many cocoa farmers live in poverty, earning just $2 a day. And Ghanaian entrepreneurs like Michael have struggled to open chocolate factories in their home country.
We are trying to decolonize chocolate. This time around, we are saying that it can be done right here in Ghana.
Now, the government is funding efforts to grow a domestic chocolate industry. But can Ghana's entrepreneurs get a bigger share of the profits? We visit a cocoa farm and processing plant to find out. Ghana, together with Ivory Coast, grows over 60% of the world's cocoa. The countries sell to all the big chocolate companies, from Hershey's to Mars to Nestle, which process the beans abroad in mostly Europe and North America.
Pacho, your friend Joseph Bacha, I'm cocoa farming for 18 years ago.
Joseph grows 11 acres of cocoa, and it isn't easy. Farmers battle more extreme weather due to climate change, plant disease, and fatigued land. Every October, he and his family begin harvesting the yellow pods. It takes just 4 days.
But mi twa ben cocoa nu kakra chain dua no na bodua no ho ban mi koto mi sorry yeti pains ewo djuma no mu pa.
Joseph collects the pods and takes them to the breaking ground. Here, workers crack them open and remove the beans by hand. Joseph uses the leftover pods as compost under his trees.
Ye boy we are ye set ahabai na ye bu.
Joseph then dries the beans for another week. In total, he packs 75 bags of beans a year. His income is about $27 a day. It's a high wage for a Ghanaian farmer, because Joseph grows organic cocoa without pesticides. But many farmers in Ghana live at or below the poverty line, earning less than $2 a day. That's because the majority of farms are small and aren't certified organic, according to Christy, a cocoa scholar nicknamed the Doc of Chalk.
We're talking about really small plots, and this is part of the reason why cocoa farmers are so poor.
But that's not the only reason farmers make so little.
Cocoa's been farmed in Ghana for over 100 years. There are many parts of the country where the land is really fatigued now, and the trees are old.
In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal and Spain monopolized cocoa, controlling production and trade from their colonies in Latin America and the Gulf of Guinea. Europe's elite were the biggest customers. The crop arrived in what's now Ghana in 1876. Around the same time, the British declared the southern region a colony and began invading north. Locals own and ran all the small farms, but the raw product was exclusively exported to Europe.
A lot of what we know today as contemporary chocolate really grew out of this trading relationship between Ghana and Britain, including the flavor of chocolate itself.
Although Ghana gained its independence in 1957, its one-way cocoa trade with Europe still exists today. And it's kept farmers at the beginning of the supply chain in poverty for generations. To help raise farmer wages, Ghana and its neighbor Ivory Coast teamed up in 2019.
The two largest cocoa producing countries in the world, and so when they get together on something, everyone has to pay attention.
They introduced the fixed price system, which set a price floor for cocoa. In 2020, Ghana set the price floor at $2,600 a metric ton. That included a $400 premium added to every ton of cocoa.
And this value goes directly to the farmers.
The premium is called the Living Income Differential, or LID. It was the first of its kind in the chocolate industry, and it meant farmers took home nearly 30% more money than the year before. At first, big chocolate companies agreed to pay the LID.
You can't really not buy Ghanaian and Ivorian cocoa, so the big buyers really had no choice.
The LID's markup may seem like a lot, but the millions it's raised to combat farmer poverty is a fraction of big chocolate makers' sales. But soon after it launched, reports surfaced accusing Hershey's of buying cocoa without paying the premium.
It's sad to note that these companies who have the resources may not want to abide by this simple appeal.
In an email to Business Insider, the company said Hershey supports and is fully participating in the Living Income Differential. When the corporations do pay, the LID has helped farmers.
It's pushing farmers to even increase their yield. That's how come last year we're able to hit a record 1.2 million tons of beans.
After farmers dry the beans, they're bagged up. About 70% of these beans will be sent overseas. Ghana processes only 30% of its cocoa beans domestically. But in 2020, at a press conference in Switzerland, the president announced he wanted to change that.
We intend to process more and more of our cocoa in our country with the aim of producing more chocolate ourselves.
And he said it right in front of the top commerce ministers of Switzerland, one of Ghana's biggest customers.
That statement in Switzerland caused a lot of controversy, I must say. He clearly mentioned our intentions to put in efforts to also add value within Ghana.
To support cocoa processing inside Ghana, the government created a free zone outside Accra. Any factory operating inside gets a tax break. Lloyd Ashley runs niche cocoa industry in the free zone.
In the free zone enclave, you are getting 10 years free duty on your imported parts for equipment. So it gives you the opportunity to also increase capacity.
Niche has become Ghana's second largest cocoa manufacturer. The company says it processes 10% of the country's cocoa, and Niche processes 2 tons of it an hour. The cocoa beans arrive here from farms all over rural Ghana. Workers stack the bags high, then cut them open one by one. The beans funnel into this grate on the floor. And the rest of the process is controlled digitally, from roasting the beans to grinding them into cocoa mass. That's then sent to get mixed with milk and sugar.
And from there, it comes here for a tempering process, a cooling process, and then a packaging process.
Niche has been pretty successful, but for small companies outside the free zone, it hasn't been as easy to get up and running.
Hello, Amos. Everything okay?
Yeah, everything's okay.
Michael runs Fair Afrique, a cocoa maker that opened in Amanasi to be closer to cocoa farmers. But since it's outside the free zone, it didn't get the tax breaks. Fair Afrique also had trouble buying cocoa beans.
As shocking as that may sound, it's really hard in Ghana to procure cocoa beans.
Another hurdle keeping Ghana's chocolate industry from taking off?
Well, it's very hard to make chocolate in Ghana.
For one, there's no dairy industry.
Anybody producing chocolate in Ghana is definitely importing large volumes of milk from either Europe or other continents.
Chocolate makers also have to import sugar, mostly from Brazil. And finally, it's hot in Ghana.
Chocolate, by its nature, is very sensitive to temperature. Any rise in temperature may cause the chocolates to melt.
There's not the kind of cold chain that you need to distribute chocolate effectively within Ghana or much of West Africa.
And building out that cold chain has been expensive.
We have used insulated building materials for some sections of our building. Some sections of the building is completely insulated roofing sheet.
Also, Ghana's power grid is sometimes unreliable.
Electricity, for example, is another issue here. Although there's power, it's never stable.
Fair Afrique's top sellers are finished chocolate bars. Inside temperature-controlled rooms, this machine pumps the chocolate into molds.
So our installation capacity is 10,000 bars of chocolate every hour.
That's a fraction of what a Hershey's or Mars factory can do. This machine wraps the chocolate bars. With 68 workers, the company's scaling up to produce 50 million bars a year.
The practice has always been that the raw materials are sent to Europe for processing. But this time around, we are saying that it can be done right here in Ghana.
Say you process cocoa no ewo Ghana ha. You be nyamu sika a ebe ba ban no nsem. Nti you be ma ya kwan be ye let ye electricity nsem be ye hospital and schools.
But Christy says the country still has a long way to go.
Definitely no silver bullets, for sure. When you have a whole system like colonialism, it doesn't shift quickly.
While there are 5 times more processing facilities in Ghana today than a decade ago, most only process cocoa into intermediate products like
cocoa butter, cocoa mass, cocoa liquor, cocoa powder, not to chocolate.
96% of Niche's business are these intermediate products. Most of the finished bars are still made abroad.
We need to increase the export of cocoa in a semi-finished and also in the finished state.
Lloyd wants to create demand for finished chocolate within Ghana.
Cocoa consumption is very, very low in Africa. Compared to Europe, where you have an average 5 kilograms per person consumption, you're talking about 0.4 in Africa.
That's because, historically, finished chocolate bars had to be imported from Europe, so they cost a lot. To create new demand in Ghana, Niche is making a chocolate drink Lloyd hopes to sell in schools. He also hopes to source ingredients from inside Africa, dairy from Egypt and sugar from South Africa. To train talent in Ghana, Farafreak started this lab and hired locals to develop new flavors. And for farmers, advocates want to raise the cocoa price floor to about $3,100 a metric ton. And they want big chocolate companies to foot more of the bill. Nearly every big chocolate producer has programs set up to lift farmers out of poverty. But by some estimates, 73 to 90% of Ghana and Ivory Coast cocoa farmers are still below living income standards.
If you're the CEO of these big companies, it's time to come down and look at these yourself.
As the industry is set to grow about 5% in the next 6 years, Ghanaian cocoa farmers and processors are vying for a larger stake in the big business of chocolate.
Ye Ghana hano anka cocoa companies ana chocolate wanga waye chocolate no dudu ampo emra country hana wombe processing cocoa no na cocoa na ye dua ye di ya hoodin ye ho adwuma no dudu no nyina ye ho adwuma wo Ghana ha ebebua yen ebebua oman no.
Can we also be allowed to add value? It will be changing the lives of the people that play real roles in growing the beans.
These bakers in Ukraine make 700 pounds of Passover matzahs a day, even as Russian forces advance. When we filmed at the Tiferes Hamatzo's bakery, the city of Dnipro wasn't invaded, but it was surrounded by war zones. For many here, making this sacred bread feels more important than ever.
Да еще плюс у нас через несколько дней будет святой праздник, праздник Песах.
This would have been illegal back when their country was part of the Soviet Union. At one point, Jews were jailed for making or even just eating matzah. But these days, the country supplies an estimated 20% of all handmade matzah to the US market.
And now we're back again, sending out the best matzah, the real matzah, throughout the whole world.
Still, more than half of Americans buy matzah that comes off an assembly line. The last family-owned matzah maker in America, called Streitz, can produce up to 1 million square-shaped sheets in a day. And it's been at it for nearly a century. Whether it's machine-made or handmade, many Jews have dedicated their lives to preserving what they call the bread of the poor. So how did this traditional food grow into a $110 million industry? Handmade matzah, called shmora, or guarded in Hebrew, is what the Ukrainian bakery Tiferes Hamatzos specializes in making.
You have to keep and you have to secure the matzah.
This is Rabbi Meir Stombler. He inherited the business from his father 12 years ago. Today, he supervises the work in accordance with Jewish law. The bakery grinds the wheat on site, and Rabbi Stombler regulates the amount of heat and moisture to keep the dough from rising.
This is custom made for us, making sure it doesn't get heated too much from the moment that the wheat is in the field, and if it has any contact with water, that is already a problem.
The unleavened bread is made of just 2 ingredients, flour and water. But making the dough is labor-intensive. Joseph says this helps him keep his mind off of what's happening outside.
Люди продолжают жить, опять продолжают выполнять наш святой долг, работают в мацапекарне.
It's all made by hand. It's going to take him about a minute until it's ready.
From there, it's a race against the clock because the dough has to make it to the oven in just 18 minutes so it doesn't rise.
When the Jews left Egypt, they didn't have time to bake their bread, so they had it very fast, and what they ate was matzah.
And everyone who touches the matzot until it's baked must be observant Jews. This metal rod helps workers knead the dough faster.
He's making sure that it's being well done, so this is a real piece of dough.
Then they roll it into long logs and flatten it out with rolling pins. When it makes it to the oven, it bakes fast.
Maximum 10 seconds, you'll see it's out of the oven, and this is a ready matzah to eat for the Seder night.
Production has been going strong despite the Russian invasion. This would be unthinkable in previous generations. The city's chief rabbi, Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, was arrested and exiled in 1939 for providing matzah for the region's Jews. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, Dnipro now has the most Jews per capita of any city in Ukraine. The massive 7-branched menorah center and surrounding neighborhood has become a hub for war relief efforts. Russia has targeted Ukrainian missiles on the outskirts of the city, and Dnipro's airport was recently attacked.
They don't have time to be afraid. We're busy with saving lives, evacuations, humanitarian aid, making sure they get whatever they need, the medicines and food, and really saving lives 24/7. There's no time to be afraid. There's no time to think about it.
Rabbi Stombler, a member of the Chabad Hasidic movement, takes pride in contributing to this renaissance, with matzah made the old-fashioned way. The constant supervision and labor makes shmura matzah 3 to 6 times more expensive than machine-made. Even though the biggest shipments left Ukraine earlier this year, the bakery exports right up until the Passover holiday.
Это маца, которая отправляется в Америку. Очень вкусная, очень хорошая, очень тонкая. Всю мацу, которую мы делаем с любовью и отправляем в Америку.
Ukraine normally exports about 70 tons of matzah each year, but war is getting in the way. Rabbi Stombler said he had 2 containers full of matzah temporarily stuck at the ports in late February.
2 hours before the boat was supposed to leave, the war broke out. We released them, but it was too late to send them to the States. Some of them stayed over here, some of them we managed to ship to the UK.
This kind of handmade matzah nearly disappeared after World War II, when mass-produced ones became more affordable. It was the son of the same rabbi arrested in Dnipro who revived it in the 1950s. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson was living in Brooklyn when he launched a campaign to distribute shmura matzah to Jewish families. And the number of people who eat shmura matzah continues to expand. America produced 1 million pounds of shmura matzah in 2017, and the market has grown 30% since then. But handmade matzah makes up just a third of all matzah sold in the United States. Mass-produced ones make up the bulk of the $110 million industry. Streitz is the last large family-owned matzah producer in the US. The company managed to stay afloat, but it had to relocate to this facility in Orangeburg, New York, in 2017, after running a factory in Manhattan for nearly a century.
The last day leaving the factory was a very sad day. We stayed probably longer than we should have, just out of nostalgia.
That's Aaron Gross, the great-great-grandson of the company's founder, Aaron Streit. Although the machines have been upgraded, he still uses the same recipe.
We're gonna say it's about 200 pounds of flour, 70 to 80 pounds of water, depending on humidity in the air.
My name is David Marvin. I work upstairs in the mixing room.
Just like at the handmade bakery, workers here have to beat the clock. The dough drops through a hopper to the floor below. Kosher laws require that the bowls be cleaned in between each batch.
Yeah, just order.
Just like in Ukraine, everyone who handles the dough from here is an observant Jew. During the run-up to Passover, there are 8 full-time rabbis at this facility, and some of the staff have worked here for decades.
Michael's worked here for 6 years. Oh no, 33 years.
Yeah, don't scare
Yeah.
Like you take care for baby, So I take care of this machine.
When something goes wrong, he springs into action.
And he drives me crazy because he's like, he'll feel it and be like, oh no, it needs a quarter pound more water. I'm like, Michael, quarter pound more water, and he's like, no, it definitely does.
This machine, called a rattler, adds a bunch of little holes.
Makes it so it's not like a lavash or a flatbread, then it cuts it in 6 rows. This belt here spreads it, and then it gets cut again and put into the oven. We're about 10 minutes into the process, and it's dropping into the oven right here. And it's gonna cook for about 1.5 minutes, 740 degrees.
The finished matzah comes out the other side. At the Rivington Street factory, workers used to load the matzah by hand onto conveyor belts as it came out of the oven. But here, robotic arms get the sheets into boxes and out the door, just in time for the Passover holiday. So why go through all this trouble for a cracker?
They say most family businesses, I think by the third generation usually screws it up. I'm fifth. So I think we hopefully got past that hump. It's a beautiful business. It's a very niche, unique business.
And is there room at the Seder table for both types of matzah?
We started as a hand bakery on Pitt Street, right? So and I think the more people that are observing Passover and are celebrating the holiday, we all grow together.
In 2021, Florida had its worst orange crops since World War II. That's because this insect is waging a war on the state's valuable citrus trees.
So this tree is infected with citrus greening. It produces small, misshapen fruit. Just see the difference.
This disease can be a tree killer.
The insect spreads a disease called HLB, or citrus greening, and it's infected nearly every citrus grove in the state.
Less canopy, you can see there's just less foliage on the tree. You can see through the tree.
The oranges are still edible. The real problem is that citrus greening has slashed Florida's production by 78%. It's cost the state nearly $8 billion and driven many growers out of the industry.
You should go back in your mind 15 years to what this place once was. As a collection of varieties, this was full of beautiful green trees.
We've had freezes, hurricanes, but citrus greening has definitely been the most challenging issue we faced in my career.
This group of scientists is racing to find a cure, armed with some unique weapons.
This is about the size that we're going to put on most new trees now.
The researchers have helped growers produce oranges on the infected trees, but they haven't found a long-term solution yet.
We will have to live with the infected trees and just make the most out of them.
So can they keep this disease at bay before it wipes out the state's orange industry? We head to Florida to find out. Larry's a fifth-generation farmer in Fort Meade, Florida.
We've been growing citrus in my family since the 1850s. When I first started in the industry, citrus occupied over 900,000 acres in the state of Florida. In fact, some years we had too much fruit and market prices were depressed.
Just 15 years ago, his family packed 1 million orange cartons a year, mostly Valencia oranges, the big, sweet, juicy kind.
You planted a grove expecting that to last for multiple generations.
The first case of citrus greening was reported in China back in 1919. It quickly spread across the continent, devastating citrus groves in India and Saudi Arabia as well. No one knows exactly how the Asian citrus psyllid made it to Florida, but in 1998, it showed up on an orange jasmine plant in a backyard in Palm Beach County. And it quickly spread throughout the state on infected rootstocks. But it would take another 7 years before Florida's orange trees showed signs of greening.
It spreads throughout the state before you even know it's present.
And in 2005, Larry found his first infected tree.
It was a real challenge and an eye-opening for us. We knew what a threat it could be to our operation, and we were fearful there were more infected trees that just had not been detected.
At first, Larry tried removing all the sick trees, but the insect moved faster, soon infecting too many to control. When a psyllid munches on a citrus tree, it leaves behind the bacteria that causes greening, here in the vascular tissue. The bacteria replicates and blocks this important highway for moving nutrients. Underground, the root systems thin and die out. Above ground,
You notice the yellow pattern, the dark green spots.
If you can see me through the canopy of this tree, that means this tree is really, really sick.
While the trees do keep bearing oranges for a few years, the fruit essentially never ripens.
You see it's small in size, it remains green, and when I cut this fruit, you see an odd shape.
You can still eat the fruit, it's just not as sweet.
The orange juice from this fruit has lower sugar content or bricks than normal fruit, but there's nothing wrong with the juice. But it's awful.
And 40% of those oranges fall off the tree sooner than usual.
The bacteria is actually starving and kills the tree over time.
Today, researchers estimate 90% of all orange trees in the state have the bacteria.
No longer do you see citrus trees abundant in the landscape.
Larry has kept his trees alive and producing for 15 years, using a combination of horticultural techniques developed by scientists at the University of Florida.
Some of our work that is going on right now is finding ways to keep those trees that do have the disease still producing fruit that are usable.
You guys want to see what some psyllids look like? Yes. All right. So they're very small. Ooh, there's an escapee actually. They're small, they kind of jump around a little bit. So we use this thing called an aspirator, or the more fun term we use with children is pooter. We just suck them up. It's basically a little vacuum in my hand.
Here, Lauren Diepenbrock can study the psyllids' movement to learn what might keep them off a citrus tree.
Using the aspirator is actually a really efficient way to collect psyllids.
She's figured out a few things that detract psyllids. First, this pink clay. It's sprayed on the trees to hide the leaves from the insect, which uses light wavelengths to see. One study showed the clay was more effective than insecticides. The second thing Lauren is researching is these 8-foot wide sheets of plastic, called reflective mulch.
The idea is that it should make it where the psyllid can't find the host plant. It could be that it blinds them or causes a visual deterrent.
Has it worked?
Somewhat. We do get psyllids. We do get them, but we do get them at a reduced rate.
A few years ago, farmers discovered that putting plastic bags around baby trees could help them grow stronger before infection. Lauren's now studying how effective these individual protective covers, or IPCs, actually can be.
So this is IPC mesh, and as you can see, there's little holes in it. You can see my hand very clearly. Wind, sun, rain, it all gets through here. The goal is to really keep that Asian citrus psyllid off the tree. And then if you look underneath, this is our irrigation.
The baby trees will grow in the IPCs for 2 years.
So you can see that the trees aren't perfect. They're still going to have some stuff on them. We do have some pest issues in here, but they look really good compared to what's in the open field. And this will actually give our trees a fighting chance once they're out in the environment, and they could potentially get infected with sea lice.
Scientist Tripti Vashish thinks the key is in the soil.
We have been learning that the trees need these nutrients to fight infection. The citrus trees, because of this disease, have very small roots or fewer roots, so they are not very efficient in picking up the nutrients. It's like a job of 10 people needs to be done by one person, same with the roots.
She figured out that giving smaller doses of fertilizer and water more frequently helps the sick roots absorb nutrients better.
And it's similar like us, 6 small meals each day rather than 3 big meals are better. Same is with the fertilizer and irrigation. Smaller doses are better than big doses.
Larry uses fertilizer custom designed for his trees. He's also planting more young ones.
One of our strategies for dealing with greening is to plant the groves at higher densities. We're planting 300 trees per acre compared to 140 to 150 trees per acre before we were dealing with the disease.
So if he knows all the trees will get infected, with more planted, hopefully some will survive. Growers have also tried releasing predator wasps and spraying insecticides. While there's no silver bullet, in combination, these short-term solutions have sort of worked.
You can slow down the decline.
We've been battling citrus greening for 15 years, and while the industry's not thriving, we're definitely surviving.
But the problem is, all these approaches tack on an extra $600 per acre onto production costs for growers.
Our revenues are down by more than half on an individual grove basis.
Growers are losing money.
And many couldn't swallow the losses. By early 2022, half of Florida's orange growers had left the industry. So while he waits for a long-term solution, Larry's taking the hit so he can keep harvesting the same way his family always has. Workers quickly pick the oranges and drop them into bags. Once they've got a good batch, pickers dump them into baskets in the grove. Workers then truck the oranges to the packing facility just down the road.
We have 8 digital cameras that takes a picture of each piece of fruit as it travels through the packing line. We use an electronic sorter to divide the crop by color.
If they're orange enough, the fruit gets cleaned and hit with a layer of natural wax.
It preserves the fruit, it extends its shelf life.
Today, because of HLB, Larry packs half as many boxes as he did 17 years ago. If the oranges are a bit too green, Larry knows they'll be hard to sell on the fresh side. So he sends them to get juiced at the Florida's Natural Plant in Lake Wales. Larry owns the juicing plant along with other local growers as part of the company's cooperative.
About 90% of the fruit grown in the state goes to orange juice.
But just like growers, the factory has been getting fewer oranges.
So less efficiency in the plant.
With a lower fruit volume, the factory had to shut down one of its 3 processing lines. Nowadays, 60,000 boxes of oranges arrive at the plant from cooperative farms across Central Florida. That's about 30,000 fewer than before HLB.
Within 24 hours of harvesting, we juice the fruit.
This machine squeezes the juice out of every orange.
We pull out any seeds, and we also collect the pulp where we can add that back to whatever degree we want to do that.
The juice gets pasteurized and then pumped into cartons. But remember, greening affects oranges' natural sugar content. So Florida's Natural has to blend infected oranges with sweeter ones from different regions or even seasons. It still tastes like orange juice, it's just not quite as sweet. Today, the factory pumps out about a third less than pre-greening.
They need a home for their fruit where they can get maximum value, that hopefully can sustain their operations until a solution to greening is found.
Many scientists believe the long-term solution lies with re-engineering nature, either genetically changing the bug itself or naturally breeding citrus trees.
Ultimately, a tree that's resistant or tolerant to the disease will be key.
That's the project Fred Gamitter and his team are working on at the University of Florida. They're trying to breed for an HLB-resistant orange variety, meaning even if the disease shows up, the tree won't get sick. To do that, he takes two different types of trees, maybe one with yummy oranges, and one that's resistant, and essentially has them mate. And their kid will hopefully still taste good, but won't get HLB.
That's really the holy grail of citrus screening research.
But that's not easy. Finding a resistant orange is like looking for a genetic needle in a haystack.
It's extremely difficult to breed new oranges.
We know of some kinds of trees related to oranges that are resistant, and we're trying to access the genetics of those resistant types by making crosses.
Fred says it could take more than a decade.
So it's long term. There's always an element of serendipity in this.
But armed with that miracle-resistant tree, they could be better prepared to tackle future diseases.
It's a global, interconnected world we live in. People and plant diseases move about pretty freely, and so there will be another problem, another disease come along.
I believe science will continue to deliver new tools that will make growing citrus easier over time. I look forward to those days. I'm sure we'll have other challenges that we'll face in time, but today citrus screening is here to stay.
India is one of the world's largest producers of salt, and a third of it comes from deep in this desert. The dry, cracked land of Little Rann of Kutch was once a seabed. Today, over 6,000 families live in this desert, farming salt by hand. They're known as the Agariyas, and they've been salt producers in this harsh environment for generations.
The
air can reach up to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And the land they work on is so salty, all to earn just $4 a ton. That same salt will sell for $260 a ton as table salt, soap, or detergent.
मेहनत इतना करता है अगरिया, इसको इतना पैसा नहीं मिलता जितना कि वो इंडस्ट्रीज वाला है, वो पैसा इन्वेस्ट करके मुनाफा कमा रहा है.
लागे से घणो फकीने क्यों.
The Agariyas have faced a long history of mistreatment.
But that stigma continues, and this is why, the salt farmers still continue to do this job.
There have been government efforts to change things in recent years, but many still live in poverty. We went to India to learn how the Agariyas became trapped in the big business of salt. Thousands of years ago, this area was part of the Arabian Sea.
अपना जो सौराष्ट्र और कच्छ दो आइलैंड थे, लेकिन जो चेंजेस आया काफ़ी साल पहले, उसमें सौराष्ट्र का प्लेट ऐसे डाउन हुआ और कच्छ का ऐसे डाउन हुआ, तो बीच वाला पार्ट एक हो गया और वो डेजर्ट बन गया.
It was still waterlogged though, as part of the Indus River Delta, but an earthquake in 1819 changed the direction of the river.
And therefore this entire area got dried up.
But the water that still sits underneath the mud is 10 times more saline than seawater, making it a perfect place to farm salt.
It was considered as a commodity which is equivalent to gold.
And the Agariyas have been working here ever since. Monsoons fill this area with water starting in June. It can take another 4 months for the waters to recede.
That is when the salt farmers come into the picture.
Bhavna Harchandani is a research scholar who lived with the salt farmers for 7 months. The agariyas arrive every year in October.
પહેલા મહિનામાં તો અમારે ગારા કામ જ કરવાનું એટલે રણ ભર્યું હોય એટલે અમારે પહેલા ચાલીને જવું પડે 1 મહિનો.
Patadia Gugabhai and his wife carry everything they'll need to live in the desert for the next 6 months, including supplies to make their huts, clothes, farming tools, and all their food and water.
અને અત્યારે હું રણમાં રહું છું કારણ કે આવા જવામાં તો મોંઘવારી પ્રમાણે જોવા જઈએ તો ઘણું ઓલું થઈ ગયું, મોંઘવારી વધી ગઈ છે એટલે રણમાં રહીએ છીએ.
First, they have to find the key to this whole operation: salty brine water underground. They dig 30 feet into the mud to get to it. Digging wells can take up to a week. The families then set up these government-subsidized solar panels. They'll power the pumps that bring brine water to the surface. Then the agariyas build the salt pans, these expansive salt flats.
જ્યારે અમે રણમાં શરૂઆતમાં આવી કામ કરવા ત્યારે આ માટીનું પાટા બનાવી અને ત્યારબાદ રોલ ફેરવવો પડે.
The roller helps them flatten out the earth.
અંદર કરી જાય રોલ ફેરવી એટલે જમીન મજબૂત બની જાય એટલે મીઠું સારું બને.
They'll make 10 to 20 pans, all by hand. It's back-breaking work.
Now, working in the desert is not a joke.
Everyone in the family pitches in to help.
પાટા ચાલતા એટલે અમે 3 જણા.
Then the farmers will release the salty brine water from the wells. It flows between the pans. By the last pan, the water reaches the 24% salinity needed to form big salt crystals. The farmers are so skilled that they know it's the perfect salinity simply by tasting the water.
तो ये जो स्क्वायर है उसमें मिनिमम 300 से लेके 400 तक सॉल्ट निकलेगा.
Over the next few months, as the water evaporates, salt crystals form.
દંતારા ખેંચવાના લોખંડના આવે દંતારા હોય એ ફેરવવાના.
This rake costs $22, too expensive for many of the farmers.
દર વર્ષે લેવા જઈએ તો મેર ન પડે એટલે હાથે નાથે રિપેરિંગ કરીને 2-3 વર્ષ ચલાવીએ અમે.
They have to rake the salt crystals every day for the first 3 months.
ફેરવવાનું કારણ હજી તો ફેરવી તો એ મોટું થાય ને કે ઉપલું ઉપલું.
They start raking early each morning to avoid the hottest part of the day.
કે જો પહેલા તો મીઠું ઓછું હોય એટલે તો એક જણો ખેંચે એટલે હાલે એટલે અને બીજા પછી વધી જાય ને મીઠું પછી એકથી દંતારો હાલે નહીં પછી 2 જણાને જ ખેંચવો પડે.
But working here can be really dangerous. The life expectancy of a farmer is about 60 years because not only do they face extreme temperatures,
They are dealing with subsoil brine, which is highly acidic, and you also an exposure to that subsoil brine also comes with a lot of problems in skin.
મને તો પહેલા તો ચામડીના રોગ થાય છે એટલે 1 મહિના લગી તો રૂજ જ ન આવે અને ચામડીનો રોગ ઈ પહેલો જ કારણ કે પહેલા પેનિયાથી ને શરૂ થાય.
many of the agariyas become blind from years of the bright sun reflecting off the white landscape. And because they're so far from the nearest village, accessing medical care is often too expensive.
અમાર નાના જો આવડી તો મીઠું છોટી ગયું ને તે ભાંગતા હતા અને એમને પગે જાણકી ફોડકી દઈને પછી મીઠામાં તો રૂજ આવે જ નહીં રણમાં એટલે પછી વધતું ગયું જો દવાખાને લઈ ગયા તે તોય ન મટ્યું 1 વર્ષ 2 વર્ષ થી 2 વર્ષ લગી એમને એ ફોડકી મોટી મોટી થી આખો પગ હડી ગયો પગ પછી કાપ્યો પછી 3 દિવસ જીવા 3 દિવસ પછી ડેથ હો ગયું.
Despite these conditions, the agariyas live and work out here until spring, when the salt is finally ready. They harvest 3 times. The first produces the best quality salt. They leave in April, usually with over 1,000 tons of salt, and they'll sell it to a trader like Rafiq Rahimbai.
नमक रण में से लेता हूँ, खरीदता हूँ. खुद का कोई प्रोडक्शन नहीं है, अगरिया से मैं खरीदता हूँ.
His team picks up the harvest with trucks. Once it arrives from the Ron,
उसको हमारा ऑफर में डालते हैं, उसके आगे हम उसको क्रशिंग करके दोनों स्क्रू में वॉशिंग करते हैं। वॉशिंग करके हमारा सेंटीफिश के अंदर नमक जाता है और सेंटीफिश वो पानी अलग कर देता है और नमक को अलग कर देता है।
Rafiq employs 200 workers at his factory in Tikar, processing and packaging salt. He says he loses about 20% of the salt during the washing and draining process.
फिर उसको हम उसमें अंदर आयोडीन डाल देते हैं, आयोडीन डाल के उसको क्रशिंग करते हैं।
It gets packaged and sold as edible powder salt and as crystal salt to be made into soap, detergent, and baking soda. This whole process refines the salt and makes it more valuable. So Rafiq can sell his product for upwards of 60 times what the farmers make. Bhavna says in the time she lived there, she saw salt traders working together to pay as little as possible.
If I am a farmer, if I go and argue that this price is too low, I need more, he will say, okay, don't give me your produce, go to someone else. And then that man, the trader, will go and tell the other trader, if this man comes to you, don't take his produce.
Rafiq denied taking part in such practices and says farmers can negotiate their prices.
अगर ये लोग हैं, वो जिसको समझो जिसको देना होगा वो देगा, ऐसा कोई बंदी का नहीं कि मेरे को देना पड़ेगा, दूसरों को भी देना पड़ेगा.
Rafiq says he pays the farmers above average, between $5 and $8 a ton, but Insider could not confirm that. And most farmers we spoke to said that this season's market price for salt is between $2 and $4 per ton.
જો મીઠું વેચવા જઈએ ત્યારે જાણે વ્યાપારી સંગઠન કરી અને એ ભાવ નક્કી કરે એ ભાવ અમને આપે.
That means in a good year, a family will earn just over $4,000 for 6 months of grueling work. But this doesn't pay for all the expenses they have as they prepare for the next harvest. So at the start of each season, many agariyas have to come back to traders like Rafiq and ask for a loan to help them get through it.
However, that taking advance has now made them fall into the vicious trap of loans and debts. This is the reason why they are unable to come out.
That means in a good year, a family will earn about $2,000 for months of grueling work. That's well below the poverty line. The agariyas have never really had control over the salt they farm. The British classified the group under the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, basically branding all members as criminals from birth. But many historians say it was really a way to control tribes that were poor, low caste, or didn't support colonial rule. The law gave police the power to monitor the agariyas' movements and arrest them with little cause. The British also owned this land, so even though the farmers were still allowed to work here, the British would take the salt to England, process it, and sell it back to Indians with a heavy tax.
The salt farmers, they were not supposed to take their salt out from the region. So what the women used to do, they used to hide the salt crystals in their petticoat, and then they would take it out because salt was expensive.
Many Indians couldn't afford the taxed salt, even though it was a staple in their diet.
If you cut off the salt supply, it's like, you are raging a war.
It got so bad that in 1930, Mahatma Gandhi organized one of his most successful acts of civil disobedience, a 240-mile salt march.
As he moved from town to town, it seemed that all of India was behind him.
60,000 protesters were jailed, including Gandhi himself. Salt would be contested until India's independence in 1947. After British rule, the agariyas were denotified, meaning they were no longer classified as a criminal tribe.
But that stigma continues.
With few other options, they were trapped, producing salt.
This is why, the salt farmers still continue to do this job.
And they're still working on land they don't own. After the British left, the little Ron of Kutch was taken over by the government, which leased it to the agariyas.
However, the government has stopped renewing their lease.
And in 1972, most of the area became a protected wildlife sanctuary.
Therefore, they are illegally producing salt. they are considered as illegal.
But the government has an unspoken agreement with the community, allowing them to keep farming around the protected areas. The government even provides equipment, like the subsidized solar panels and boots to help protect against foot infections. In the long term, the salt farmers and their advocates hope for more government involvement, starting with setting a minimum price for salt. Ecologist Ajay fears that might backfire.
सॉल्ट फार्म बढ़ने के कारण इकोलॉजी पे ये असर हो रहा है कि पूरा जो ग्राउंड वाटर है वो भी धीरे धीरे कम होता जा रहा है। अगर ऐसे ही रहा और ऐसे ही इंस्ट्रूमेंट से लोग सॉल्ट बनाते हैं और अगर सॉल्ट फार्म ज़्यादा बढ़ रहे हैं तो ये भी हो सकता है कि आज से 20 साल के बाद शायद ग्राउंड में पानी ही नहीं रहेगा तो यहाँ पे शायद सॉल्ट भी नहीं बनेगा।
As their own farming depletes the brine, the Agarias are moving deeper into the desert, further away from established towns and villages.
Probably we can at least provide them with minimum water facilities so that, at least they have some amenities.
But until help arrives, these people will be back next season.
Brazil nuts don't come from farms. They're collected deep in the Amazon rainforest, often by indigenous people.
Desde o nosso antepassado já trabalhamos.
But harvesting them is not easy. Collectors gather, crack, and haul 110-pound loads out of the jungle.
Se bater na cabeça, pode até levar à morte.
But this industry nearly collapsed 20 years ago when middlemen paid farmers just pennies per kilo.
As família também não ia no mato, né? As castanhas praticamente estragavam no mato.
So harvesters banded together to sell directly to factories, increasing their income significantly. Now the industry is at risk again. This time because of deforestation. We visited the Apiaca tribe to see how they saved this big business once before and if they can do it again. Almost every other nut that you can buy in a store comes from massive plantations. But Brazil nuts can only be foraged in the wild. They grow across this region, spanning Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru. The industry supports 60,000 families in the Brazilian Amazon. Many are indigenous. Villagers say 95% of their community works in the industry during the season. Each morning, workers load up their dinghies. They commute 10 miles along the Rio dos Peixes. Then they hike into the rainforest. Evanilson Krishi Morima is the president of the Apiaca tribe.
Mas para identificar outra pessoa que está a longa distância, né? Para a gente saber a direção certa.
They're headed to Brazil nut trees that grew thanks to these guys, the agoutis. The rodents bury the fallen pods to eat later.
So when the rodent has a bad memory, there will be a new tree. If a rodent is eaten by a jaguar, there will be a new tree.
The Brazil nut trees can live to be 500 years old. They reach 165 feet tall, as high as a 15-story building. And their trunks over 6 feet wide.
Because they are usually above every other trees in the canopies.
Collectors wait for the pods to drop naturally between November and May. That's what makes this such a sustainable nut. Each tree drops about 300 pods every season, and they can come down at 50 miles per hour.
If you are down there and one of these things fall in your head, you're dead.
Catar ouriço por ouriço. Vou fazer montinho e jogar lá no...
Then they get to work cracking.
Como eu já cortei meu dedo, dentro desse ouriço tem aproximadamente varia de 15 a 30 castanhas dentro.
They make their way back, this time carrying bags that are roughly 100 pounds.
Pega uma caixa de supermercado e lava a castanha.
Workers will spread them out on beds to dry them in the hot sun.
Depois da secagem, a gente pode embalar. Coloca num saco limpo
The apiaca once numbered in the tens of thousands. But they haven't had an easy past, facing massacres, persecution, epidemics, and enslavement from rubber tappers. And now there's less than 1,000 apiaca left. In the 1900s, they started selling and exporting nuts to Europe. They depended on middlemen from big cities who made the trip to their remote village to buy nuts for just 6 cents a kilo.
Não tinha ninguém para recorrer, era o jeito de entregar a nossa produção com preço bem mínimo, né?
It wasn't lucrative enough, and many families left the industry altogether.
It collapsed big time. When the price of the nuts is so low, then it is not an incentive to people to harvest it.
While agricultural cooperatives aren't a new concept, environmental technician Antonio Vieira Gimelo thought it might work for the apiaca. So he joined 4 tribes across Mato Grosso into one cooperative called Copama. The collectors would then sell directly to the cooperative, cutting out the middlemen completely. And the idea saved the local nut industry.
E hoje em dia já estão trabalhando com R$8 o quilo, né?
That's about $1.64 a kilo. It may not sound like much, but it's more than a 2,000% increase from the 6 cents collectors made before. Workers then transport the dry nuts to a processing factory in the town of Juruena.
Uma viagem aí de 500 quilômetros de distância para esse produto chegar até na Copavã.
Once the nuts arrive, workers transfer them to the dryer. They'll stay here for 10 to 12 hours.
Lá é colocado lenha, manda o vapor para cá, secou, manda para os barracões onde ela vai ficar estocada para a gente estar trabalhando durante todo o ano.
The factory tries to stock up, so they have enough supply to last the 6 months of the off-season. They're dried again for 4 days to extend the shelf life. Then they had to get steamed to loosen up the shell.
A gente leva para torragem e depois elas voltam para fazer a seleção final, que é o processo de tirar casquinhas, ver se tem alguma danificada, separar o restante da quebrada da inteira e fazer um empacotamento que é para levar.
Although harvesting them is labor-intensive, Brazil nuts are used to fill space in bags of mixed nuts.
I like cashews better. I like almonds better. Probably I have eaten too many.
But Copava has managed to make it profitable. It processes 370 tons of Brazil nuts a year in this factory and brought apiaca families back into the industry. The nuts will get packaged and sold to be used in snack packs, chocolate bars, and cakes. Some of the biggest customers? The US, Netherlands, and Germany. Now, the industry is facing another challenge: deforestation.
Esse trabalho todo, ele pode se acabar, entendeu? A floresta acabando, a gente não tem como continuar esse trabalho.
Nearly 5 million acres of the Amazon were cleared in 2021 to raise cattle and grow soy, African palm, and corn.
What they want is land, and they just get rid of all the forests. They are not after the woods.
The state of Mato Grosso has one of the worst rates of deforestation in Brazil, and the apiaca don't have enough resources to protect their land themselves. Now the government does protect Brazil nut trees, meaning it's against the law to cut one down. That's why you'll see single Brazil nut trees standing alone in fields.
Brazil nut trees depend on an ecologically healthy forest.
They can't survive without the cooler temperatures of the rainforest or the special bees that pollinate them. Over time, they stop producing Brazil nuts.
It takes about 15 years for a tree to die slowly. It's a very sad picture. It makes me very sad just thinking about it.
So can the locals save Brazil's nut economy again? One way to do that is by investing more in diversified final products like this nut oil. The oil sells for double the price of raw nuts, and making it saves broken nuts from going to waste. It's used in everything from food to cosmetics.
Perfumes, cremes, hidratantes.
Advocates say the solution could also be as simple as marketing. By some estimates, locals can earn 3 times the profit from Brazil nuts than from illegal logging. Brazil nuts are also one of the most sustainable nuts. And growing this industry could give locals a reason to preserve their ecosystem.
Essa árvore é super importante para essas comunidades. Hoje é fonte de renda.
And that's the value and the magical thing about Brazil nuts is that by consuming every nut, we are protecting forests. And we are doing our little bit of actually saving the Amazon.
This isn't snow. It's limestone. And miners risk their lives to carve it out of the white quarries of Egypt. The valuable rock is at the center of a huge industry. And it's used to make everything from cement and glass to plastic and tiles. It's even what the Great Pyramids were made out of. But digging up and cutting these precious blocks is really dangerous. Miners face clouds of dust that can cause diseases, and they work with sharp blades under the brutal sun, with temperatures reaching beyond 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And all they have to protect them is a cloth mask.
في ناس ما تعرفش عننا أي حاجة فتلاقيه مستغرب قوي من كلامك.
Atif Fatih Zaki has been working here since he was just 14 years old.
واحد رجله تتقطع، ممكن واحد ايده تتقطع، واخد بالك ممكن واحد صباعه يتقطع، فتلقى يعني خطر كتيرة مش قليلة.
All for a wage of just about $6 a day. But in this area, it's one of the only available jobs.
عايز تصرف عليهم وتوكلهم وتشرب، مضطر تعمل كده.
The government has tried to crack down on mines after a slew of deaths, but many are still operating, even illegally. We head to Egypt to see just how bad mine conditions are, and learn why miners take the risk anyway. About 160 miles south of Cairo sits one of the largest limestone deposits in the world. This is Alminya, Egypt, and hundreds of mines dot the landscape. Tens of thousands of freelance miners chip away at this land. For these guys, each day starts in Minya City at dawn. And this is where the danger begins. These trucks aren't meant for passengers. Workers have gotten injured from falls along the winding journey.
وعربية صندوق يعني كده نتجمع كلنا مع بعضنا في العربية فبنبقى مزنقين يعني ببعضين.
The trip to the mountain takes about 40 minutes.
نوصل الجبل حوالي الساعة 6 الصبح بالظبط.
The workers first share a meal while the sun rises. Then it's time to get suited up. Since these miners are freelancers, they have to buy their own protective gear. Often, homemade cloth masks, gloves, and sunglasses are all miners have to shield them. They grab their tools and descend into the pit. The most important one is the round saw, and that's also the most dangerous. First, miners have to set up these 2 rails. 2 separate machines roll along the tracks. They slice the stone into perfect cuboids beneath.
دي في الصالة في الأول دي بتشتغل مرة 40 ومرة 20. الحشاشة بقى بتحش البلوكة من تحت وبتربعها.
The machines move quickly. They're really heavy and they're loud.
بالنسبة للصوت واخد بالك زي ما نكون احنا اتعودنا عليه خلاص. يعني بقى لك 25 سنة في شغلانة، 20 سنة، 15 سنة، فأنت تأقلمت على الصوت.
Workers shout at each other to warn the machines are nearby. Because the real hazard is those saws. A quick step is all that separates miners from razor-sharp blades.
لازم يكون عينك تكون على الموس وهو شغال. الموس وهو شغال لو خبط حد وهو بيلف هيموت على طول.
Miners are responsible for fixing the machines when they break and sharpening the blades by hand. That's also risky work.
دي بتركب في المكنة. نركبها بالمكنة ونربطها ب4 مسامير عشان الموس ما يفلتش من المكنة يعور حد. واخد بالك؟ فكل مدى كده كل نص ساعة ساعة لازم نسنه بالصاروخ. واخد بالك نطيبه عشان يسرع أكتر.
The cutting machines used to have coverings, but they fell off years ago. Now the blades are exposed.
لو غطيناه مش هنشوف. طب احنا هنعرف ازاي المقاس اللي احنا عايزينه، هنعرف ازاي الشغل اللي احنا عايزينه.
While the mine owner says he makes sure the electrical wires are covered, many are unprotected.
بتوصل توصيله مش بتاعتك، لازم انت تبقى عارف الكابل بتاعك، التوصيله بتاعتك عارفها ومتاكد منها، فعشان كده لازم انت تبقى قدام عينك عريانه شايف.
As the machines cut stone, they kick up rocks in a haunting white cloud of limestone powder. If there's no wind, miners disappear in it, like ghosts. It's easy to inhale the fine dust. And if they breathe it long enough, it can cause a lung condition called silicosis.
صار التهابات على صدري، جتني حساسية من البودرة دي. أصعب شغلة دي في الصيف. بالنسبة لي مفيش هوا.
Injuries, sickness, and death in these mines are widely reported, but there aren't any official numbers. At one point, the life expectancy here was just 45 years old.
في ناس دراعتها اتقطعت من الموس، في ناس دماغها لا مؤاخذة الموس دخل فيها ماتت.
ناس كتير بعيد عنك اتقطعت رجلها.
Zaki says many mine owners will offer under $200 by way of workers' comp.
التعويض ما يسكرش. بالنسبة لي لما تقطع رجله وما تتقطع ايده هيتعوض الرجل يتعوض ولا الرجل يتعوض ما يتعوضش.
Once the stone is safely cut, workers turn the blocks so the machine doesn't break them as it goes by again. At the start of a new quarry, the stones don't come out perfect. Those chunks head to a separate factory to be ground into powder. Perfectly cut stones that haven't been sold yet get stacked. But these blocks have already been purchased, so miners throw them straight into the truck. And they have perfect aim. If they're lucky, they might get a $3 stipend for food and tea on top of their $6 daily wage.
بعد موت اديك ناظر انت اديك معنا الصبح وتعبان اديك شوف. يا دوبك استر البيت بس مش دايما. اديك شايف الشغل.
لا حسب الظروف، حسب ظروف الطوب، لو المحجر فيه طوب مفيش بيع، الطوب قاعد في المحجر بنقعد نستنى لما الطوب ده يتشال وبعد كده نيجي نشتغل تاني.
The bricks are sent to Cairo, which has around 80% of Egypt's limestone processing capacity. The limestone is made into cement and tiles and used in papermaking, plastic production, agricultural products, and even medicine. Globally, the limestone market hit an estimated $73 billion in 2020. Today, Egypt is the largest exporter of limestone in Africa, producing more than 150,000 metric tons. The stone is so lucrative that Minya's economy depends on it. That's why many miners do this work. Their $6 wage is more than they'll make farming or working in construction.
انت حط نفسك مكان انت راجل متجوز ومخلف ومعاك عيال وعايز تصرف عليه وما فيش غير الشغله دي في محافظه المنيا فعشان كده ما نشتغلها هي ما فيش غير محافظه المنيا جايه مع الشغله دي.
And more people, from students to farmers, flock to the mines when unemployment spikes.
متزوج وعندي بنتين وانا طبعا انا اللي بعول الاسره طبعا.
But human exploitation for mining limestone in this area is not new. In fact, its history is ancient. Through the years, Egyptians used the stone in pyramids, temples, and tombs. Dark limestone made up the core of the Great Pyramids of Giza, and blinding white limestone once covered the outside, symbolizing purity and sacredness. Then, in 1303, an earthquake loosened the outer stones of the Great Pyramid. The white layer was stripped off to be used in the construction of mosques. Today, by one estimate, more than half the limestone quarries in Minya are unlicensed. The government has cracked down on some, closing 400 by 2019 after reports of injuries. But many illegal mines are still operating, with deadly conditions and no oversight. So, workers have had to take matters into their own hands. They negotiated a pay raise and created a fund for injured workers and their families. But they faced pushback from mine owners.
قالوا نأمن عليكم ومش هنأمن عليكم ما فيش لا تأمين ولا في أي حاجة.
The mine we filmed is licensed. It's called Uncle Walid's. But the owner told Business Insider the miners still have to provide their own gear.
لا ما فيش أمان، الأمان عند ربنا وعينيك. أنت مسؤول عن نفسك، أنت لو تعورت ما حدش هيسأل فيك. واخد بالك؟ صاحب المحجر ياخد يسأل عليك مثلا أسبوع 2 3 وخلاص، شهر بالكثير وخلاص. لكن أنت تبي لنفسك والواحد تبي لصحته وخلاص.
At the end of his shift, Atif relaxes with a cup of tea and a meal with his friends. The eerily beautiful mine stretches in front of them. It's a beauty they hope will get the world's attention, enough to send some help.
نفسي نعيش حلوين، مش عايزين غير لقمة العيش صدق. الناس مش عايزة غير تاكل وتشرب وخلاص عايشة زي الناس.
At the beginning of the year, this Vietnamese town turns a sea of pink. About 70% of Quang Phu Cao village make incense sticks. That's about 3,000 households, all in preparation for Tet, or Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the country's most important holiday.
Thắp hương thì là một nét văn hóa tâm linh của người Việt.
Artisans here have made these colorful incense sticks for generations, but the industry almost didn't survive. Many young workers left for more lucrative jobs.
Ngày xưa thì gần như 100% dân làng đều làm. Hiện nay ở làng chúng tôi thì chỉ còn vài ba nhà sản xuất lớn thôi.
Then in 2019, India, the village's biggest customer, restricted imports of Vietnamese incense sticks. So T had to change his production process and find buyers within Vietnam. Through his cooperative, he's been able to stay afloat, crafting 50,000 sticks a day. We visited the village's largest factory to see how it's keeping the incense tradition alive. Incense sticks have two parts, the core stick and the incense powder.
Cái chân hương thì được làm bằng cây lứa ở trên rừng.
Once the bark is harvested, farmers bring the bunches here to be weighed and sold. Just down the road, villagers carefully split the bark into smaller sticks and lay them out to dry in giant stacks around town. Next, they head to the chopper.
Máy chẻ hiện nay thì 100% là dùng bằng máy.
With the machine's help, they can chop tens of thousands of sticks in a day.
Máy chẻ sau đó được trà sát, đánh bóng và cắt ra được thành những đoạn phù hợp với lại cái kích cỡ của nén hương.
Which can be up to 16 inches long. Then they're trucked to T's incense factory. Here, workers sort the stems into bunches. Then they hand-dip the ends in colorful buckets of dye. They're dyed either pink, which represents the lotus, Vietnam's national flower, or red, for the country's flag. Carefully, the bunches are fanned out to dry. In preparation for the Tet holiday, workers blanket the village in these pink bunches.
Công nhân chỉ nhuộm buổi sáng và đến chiều là thu được. Còn là một lắng nữa là thu được. Khô và làm khô.
Over on the other side of the factory, workers make the incense powder. In this village, locally harvested cannery sap is mixed with charcoal for the signature black color. The exact proportions are secret.
Về cơ bản là công thức đó được truyền từ các cụ ngày xưa để lại.
This mixture gives the sticks their fragrance when burned.
Như hương về hương trầm, hương bài.
Once the pink sticks are done drying, workers feed them into one of these machines. It automatically coats on the incense powder.
Ngày xưa thì các cụ chiếu làm thủ công 100% và sản lượng nó gấp gần 10 lần so với làm tay.
Workers dry the sticks a second time.
Chúng tôi tiến hành phơi trên dàn phơi.
They need good temperature and lots of sun, because if the incense is wet, it won't burn.
Tầm 30 đến 100 độ là tốt. Cao quá thì hương nó sẽ cong hơn. Bản thân ở phần thân chúng tôi đã có cái mái che di động, khi mà mưa chúng ta kéo ra ngay. Chúng tôi sẽ tiến hành lựa chọn nhặt các hương nó lỗi.
Next, workers package up the sticks in plastic. Today, tea sells mostly to wholesalers within Vietnam, at 65 cents a bunch. But like most of this village, tea used to sell primarily to India, about 300 tons a year. Those sticks, used in religious worship, were shorter, and tea added no fragrance because Indian buyers preferred to add their own. India was Vietnam's biggest customer. By some estimates, 90% of India's incense imports came from Vietnam. But in 2019, India partially banned imported Vietnamese incense sticks.
Nói chung là sụt giảm rất nhiều, bởi vì cái lượng sản xuất đi Ấn Độ nước ngoài là rất là nhiều.
Paired with younger generations leaving for other jobs, Quang Phu Cao's incense industry struggled. Wanting to keep the century-old tradition alive, T got creative. First, he designed the product to better reflect Vietnamese tastes. He cut the sticks longer, dyed them pink, and added fragrance. Then he added machines to speed up production. The workers went from being able to make 500 sticks a day by hand to 50,000 using machines. T also launched a cooperative with 12 other incense makers in the village.
Được thành lập hợp tác xã thì có đăng ký kinh doanh đàng hoàng.
That way he could recruit more workers outside his village. Next, he set out to find new buyers inside Vietnam to replace his lost business from India. So T got his product registered with the National Office of Intellectual Property. Now his products are traceable with barcodes, making it easier to find domestic wholesale buyers. Today, T sells about 80 tons domestically each year. That's less than a third of what he sold to India. But he has ramped up production for Vietnamese customers. Now his cooperative's factory is the largest in the village.
Thì về cơ bản là 90% là khách hàng cũ. Mỗi năm sẽ tìm một nhất là đến dăm đến 3 cái đơn vị mới, tức là ở trên các cái tỉnh mới.
T now has enough capacity to prepare for his biggest event of the year, Tet. Incense sticks are used in religious ceremonies in temples year-round. The line of incense smoke is said to connect the spiritual world to this one.
Cầu cho một thế giới bình an, mọi nhà mọi người đều an lành mạnh khỏe, hạnh phúc, an khang thịnh vượng.
But come Vietnamese Lunar New Year, usually in January or February,
thắp nén nhang thơm để tỏ lòng thành kính với ông bà tổ tiên, những người đã khuất, và mời các cụ còn ở ngoài đồng về để ăn Tết với con mười cháu. Ngày Tết thì thường người ta thắp nhiều hương hơn.
The factory runs all year, but in the lead up to Tet, T earns 40% more in revenue, and his team makes 200 more pounds of incense sticks daily. He also makes yellow, brown, and red sticks, as well as incense coils and cones.
Nó có nhiệt và nó thơm, đặc thù nó hay. Hương nén thì thời gian thắp thì nó nhanh thôi, nó chỉ được 1 tiếng. Khi thắp hết đèn hương, cái bát hương động lên cái bàn thờ nó được hồng, được đỏ, đẹp bàn thờ.
They spread the sweet aroma of the Quang Phu Cao incense village across Vietnam.
Hiện nay thì chúng tôi là những người thế hệ sau này đã quyết tâm là giữ gìn và phát huy cái bản sắc làng nghề truyền thống.
This machine is extracting the slime from snails in the name of beauty. It will end up in skincare products around the world to repair and moisturize the skin. Historically, the way to get snail mucin was by killing them. But new machines like this one stimulate the snails instead. Companies around the world have adopted the technology. Here in Italy, snail farming has reportedly increased by more than 300% over the past 2 decades. Just in time for an almost $4 billion snail beauty market to take off.
E la richiesta del prodotto è incredibile.
Advocates often claim their products can improve wrinkles and texture. But can snail slime really do all that? And how has it become such a big business? Simone Sampo always knew he wanted to be a snail expert.
Bambini tradizionali giocavano a pallone, giocavano degli sport. Il mio hobby era proprio quello di andare a raccogliere questo mollusco. Da qua a 20 anni lascio economia e commercio per dedicarmi alla professione di elicicoltore.
He's led the International Institute of Heliciculture in the northern Italian town of Carrasco since 2016.
L'Italia è un paese favorevole alla crescita di questo mollusco.
Through the Institute, Simone helped develop methods that create ideal conditions to grow and harvest snails. And they haven't exactly been moving at a snail's pace. Simone says they've seen a huge increase in demand.
People are trying to opt for what is known as clean beauty, kind of more organic, plant-derived, animal-derived products.
It all starts in rooms like this one.
In questo modo, quando c'è questo gonfiore, è perché questa è una chiocciola piena di uova, quindi
The eggs hatch after about 2 weeks. And then go to an incubation room. The Institute sells the baby snails to farmers who raise them outdoors, using methods developed by the Institute. Simona Basile is one of them. She started out in 2019 with about 33,000 snails.
Io comincio a bagnare alle 6. Ho visto che la vegetazione non viene tanto rovinata, quindi bagnando dalle 6 fino alle 8 loro si svegliano e poi gli metto da mangiare.
The snails mostly eat vegetables like cabbage and spinach. They are also fed a supplement containing corn, soy, and other flours to strengthen their shells. Once the snails reach adulthood after about 1 year, farmers can sell them back to the Institute or to private buyers. Simona will take these 11-pound boxes to the Institute.
La bava la utilizziamo nella farmaceutica per dei gastroprotettori, per gli sciroppi per la tosse, per prodotti per le dermatiti.
As for the slime, it's what helps snails move and protect themselves against small predators. But it also contains antioxidant properties that are said to repair skin damage. So, how do heliculturists get snail slime for beauty products? It's a centuries-old practice. But back in the day, the snails had to be killed for the slime to be extracted. The tale goes that Greek physician Hippocrates applied crushed snails to treat skin inflammations. Later on, snails were dunked in pots of salt water and vinegar that forced them to release the slime. That is, until it was discovered snails would also release slime if they were stimulated. So, Simone spent years developing this machine to get them to release the mucus without killing them. He describes it as a little spa for snails. The steel structure has 2 domes that can fit about 44 pounds of snails. The snails are first cleaned with water and ozone. Then they're sprayed with an acidic solution that makes them release the slime as a defense mechanism. The Institute says this process doesn't cause harm to the animals. The machine extracts about 118 ounces of slime during the 1-hour process.
All'interno è già presente l'acqua e il siero di bava di lumaca. Noi andremo ad aggiungere la fragranza e gli attivi per poi completare la nostra formula.
It will then be distributed through the Institute's Lumidea brand to 7 countries. It sells for about $60. But that's not the end of it. The snails go through this process about 3 or 4 times before they are euthanized with a highly concentrated solution of ozonated water.
Utilizziamo tutto di questo animaletto, un po' come il maiale. Nulla si spreca e tutto si trasforma. In che modo?
The intestines are used for gourmet dishes. The shells for cosmetic products. And the eggs to make snail caviar. The products are distributed through the Lumaceria Italiana company, which Simone also leads.
Il mercato del food la fa ancora da padrona. Si pensa che nei prossimi 7 anni il mercato della cosmesi raggiungerà sicuramente il mercato del food.
Part of it may have to do with the rising global influence of K-beauty. South Korea is one of the top 10 beauty markets in the world. It's established itself as a snail cream superpower. And North America is projected to be the fastest growing region for snail beauty products. In the US, brands that use snail mucin have expanded their presence through retailers like Target and CVS. There's also growing demand worldwide for products that protect against aging and pollution. And consumers seem to be gravitating toward natural skincare ingredients. Studies have shown it can treat radiation-induced irritations, wounds, and burns.
I've seen the wound healing benefits and the skin regenerative benefits of using snail mucin after laser procedure.
But the clinical research is limited, and the slime's long-term effectiveness is yet to be seen.
The hope will be that it will move from just this anecdotal kind of idea to something that's more clinically investigated.
Simone has faith in its future. His company says its studies have shown the slime has compounds like allantoin and elastin that repair and moisturize the skin.
Il mio vuole essere un segnale, un richiamo a Elon Musk proprio di dirgli portiamo la nostra chiocciola sullo spazio. Con lei possiamo nutrirci, possiamo curarci, possiamo farci bello.
Each of these cocoons holds almost 1,000 feet of silk. And these wiggly little guys are responsible for spinning them. Here in Nam Cao, Vietnam, craftspeople weave silk that's so valuable it can sell for $150 a dress. That's because this is really delicate work. Each cocoon has to be hand-pulled, and the worms themselves are really hard to raise. For one, they're always hungry, and they need the perfect environment, or else they'll die. Today, Vietnam is the second biggest producer of raw silk in the world. Nearly everyone in this village works in the industry, and they're using many of the same techniques passed down for generations. But about a decade ago, the industry in this town almost dried up.
Đến khi tôi về gần 10 năm trước, làng nghề chỉ còn có 3 hộ.
Fake silk from China had flooded the market, and warmer temperatures were threatening the worms' lives. But this area revived itself, thanks to Han. She got farmers to weave more profitable goods and helped them reinvest in new technologies that boosted production.
Chúng tôi đã trao quyền cho bà con.
We head to Vietnam to see how one village saved its big business of silk. Silkvillages.Vietnam. And they produce silk in a tedious 30-step process. It all starts in fields like this one. There aren't any worms out here. This is just their food, and they need this much of it. These leaves contain vitamins, amino acids, and enough moisture that the worms never need to drink water. Farmers bring loads of harvested leaves to the silkworm houses.
Phòng này để nuôi tằm. Đúng rồi, cái mùi tằm với mùi của tằm. Nhất là khi mà nó chuẩn bị nó còn chín, nó còn hơi, nó còn có khi nó còn hơi.
Han Van Tin is a 35-year veteran farmer. He buys tens of thousands of worms from breeders each year. And he raises them on big bamboo mats on the first floor of his home. When it's feeding time, he lays a net on the worms. Then he heaps 3 pounds of food on top. The healthy worms crawl through the holes and get to munching.
Khay tằm nó vậy là những con nào mà nó xấu ấy, thì nó lọt lại ở dưới.
And they eat over 600 pounds of leaves a day.
Ruộng ăn cơm nằm, nuôi tằm ăn cơm đứng, chỗ đó cụ nói vậy mà.
Meaning Tin can't rest because the worms eat every 4 hours.
Nếu mà mình không cho ăn thì sao? Thì tơ nó sẽ kém chất lượng hơn, tơ sẽ không nhiều.
They also need a sterile environment and a perfect temperature of around 22 degrees Celsius.
Con tằm là chủ yếu là sợ nhất là nó bị bệnh gọi là bệnh sâu sắn gai người. Không có tơ trong bụng.
After nearly a month of eating and sleeping, their bodies will plump up.
Tơ nó nhìn có thể tơ vàng nhìn lên và để chúng ta cho lé lên và để ra thành kén.
Tin delivers the worms to another family in Hong Kong. They hang them on racks stuffed with straw. The worms spit the silk out of this organ, called a spinneret. During this vulnerable time, workers fight off bees that attack the silkworms. The worms need sunny weather to produce colorful cocoons, because if it's rainy and gray outside, the cocoons could lose their color and look damaged. Within 2 days, the cocoons are ready. Workers remove each one by hand. Once they've got a big enough pile, they boil the cocoons in water. That way, they can kill the pupae insides and either eat them or use them in traditional medicine.
Như ở quê mình thì mình cắt ra, sau đó là các bà mang rang lá chanh, chẳng hạn như làm mồi cho các ông uống bia hoặc là ăn cơm vẫn bình thường, không có vấn đề gì.
Then they soak the cocoons for another 5 to 7 hours before pulling the threads.
Nấu vào vùi 3-5 tiếng, tại sao phải nấu vùi vậy? Để cho sợi nó mềm ra.
Families here pass down the delicate technique of hand pulling thread.
Mà coi như là tôi làm đến gia đình nhà tôi làm đến tôi là đời thứ 4. Con gái tôi là đời thứ 5 bây giờ vẫn tiếp tục.
Pham Thi Buong has worked in silk for nearly 60 years. She'll unravel about 70 grams of thread a day.
Kéo như này nhá, xong cứ kéo như này là ngày chỉ được
Trong nước và có những cái đôi bàn tay mà nó chai, nó sạn và cũng như là nó dợt hết đi. Nhưng mà sao trong tình yêu của các nghệ nhân vẫn đang còn rất là nhiều.
This machine reels the silk. Workers then hang the threads to dry.
Đài mà bà đánh mà không chuẩn mắt lên nó đứt. Đấy. Thì là người dệt cũng vất vả mà nó lặn xuống những cái cục.
Next, the threads head to the cooperative to be woven.
Nói luôn là đây là những sợi tơ chất lượng 5A xuất khẩu đi châu Âu.
And finally, the silk gets dunked 100 times in all natural dyes. They use gak fruit for red, almond leaves or turmeric for yellow, tallow leaves for black, and indigofera for, well, indigo. It's the same technique they've used for generations. Silk weaving dates back 4,000 years in Vietnam, all the way to the Bronze Age. For millennia, it was the fabric of choice for nobility. And in its heyday in the 16th to 18th century, traders came from all over the world to buy Vietnam's silk. Beginning in the 2000s, Vietnam's temperatures heated up, and storms came more frequently.
Cái con tằm này thì nó không có ưa nhiệt độ ẩm cao.
There was also an influx of counterfeit silk from China.
Mà mình không thể biết được những người thực sự trong nghề hoặc là mình sử dụng bằng đốt cháy lên thì mình mới biết được thôi.
Real silk will burn slowly and smell like burnt hair, while the fake stuff will burn quickly and smell like plastic. Prices for Vietnam's silk fluctuated, dropping as low as $3 per kilo. With less profit, young people took jobs in textile factories in the cities to earn more.
Những cái mà làng nghề gần như mất đi và gần như ngày đấy là mọi người đã gần như là chán lắm rồi.
Han heard the story of the diminishing craft village when she visited in the early 2010s, and she wanted to help. She quit her job in interior design and decided to band families together.
Đó là tôi mới thành lập lại hợp tác xã, là hợp nhau, cùng hợp thay vì chỉ là một người làm thôi, rất là nhỏ bé. Chúng ta phải giữ lấy nghề, bởi vì nghề này nó góp phần cho đất nước, cho quê hương, cho mỗi vùng miền.
She got farmers to purchase air conditioning units so they could raise worms in any weather.
Thế là mình phải lắp điều hòa, giữ cái nhiệt độ cho nó mát mẻ.
They went from being able to produce 440 to 600 pounds of cocoons per year to over 2,200 pounds. Han introduced benefits for the farmers, like holidays off and helping stabilize the price for silk.
Nó chỉ một giá thôi cho nên là mình yên tâm về được cái giá cả.
Today, over 200 families in Nam Cao are part of her cooperative, pumping out 220 pounds of silk a month. And each family can make up to $12,000 a year, a high wage for this area. They weave a silk that is great at moisture and temperature control, making it breathable in the summer and insulating in the winter. Because of these properties, silk from Han's collective can be used in everything from sofa covers, curtains, and suits to pillowcases and sheets.
Bằng tơ tằm. Thế là thế này nhá, còn có cái vỏ bọc của nó thì là đấy.
Những khách hàng của chúng tôi là những nhà thiết kế thời trang, những nhà nhập khẩu về decor nội thất, rồi các cửa hàng, các siêu thị mẹ và bé.
Han hopes the success of the Nam Khao cooperative will attract young talent back into the industry, so farmers can reinvest in the town.
Sau này là tương lai sau này thì như Hạnh nói là sẽ về làm đây cái khu để chăn nuôi và làm nhà kính nhà gì đó hay là nhà chăn nuôi tầm lạnh.
Until then, they'll keep spinning away.
Yêu người bao nhiêu thì yêu nghề bấy nhiêu.
Giờ con cô thì đang làm cho ở dệt túi Nam Cao Hạnh rồi, còn giờ cô còn mong là đến làm cho các cháu chắc như cô nữa.
Tôi là vẫn cứ phát triển, càng mong càng phải phát triển hơn nữa chứ không phải là bỏ.
This is a natural sea sponge getting trimmed. And it was harvested here in Tarpon Springs, Florida, the sponge capital of the world.
No sponges, no Tarpon Springs.
By some estimates, about 70% of the natural sea sponges collected globally come from this stretch of Florida's coastline. Generations of residents, many Greek, have built their lives around this foamy sea creature.
I don't know how to do anything else.
Sponge divers here have harvested these animals, yes, they're animals, since the 1900s. But the industry has been struggling recently. Increasingly frequent hurricanes have prevented fishermen from heading out to sea. Some of those storms even killed the sponges. And high fuel costs over the last year have turned some away from working in the industry at all. But sponge diving has faced challenges in the past and has bounced back before. Sponge sales still bring in a couple $1 million a year. But Tarpon Springs has found another way to leverage its storied history.
It supports probably close to $20 million worth of tourism.
We head to Florida's Gulf Coast to find out how sea sponges became such a big business and why divers are fighting to keep their trade alive. Anastasios Charistinos arrived here from Greece in the early 1970s. The 70-year-old now goes by Captain Tasso.
His name is Tasso Charistinos.
Ocean is, I feel like my house, home for me.
And we ended up in Tarpon Springs. Greek town, Greek music, Greek restaurants, so I fit into a place.
Sponge diving dates back to ancient Greece. In fact, both Homer and Aristotle wrote about the creatures. Back then, people used them for bathing, cleaning, painting, and decorating, the same as today. When settlers found natural sponge beds in Florida in the 1800s, Greeks began making their way to America, bringing their trade with them. In the olden days, they'd wear suits like this. But nowadays, divers wear wetsuits in the summer and insulating dry suits in the winter, and they strap on scuba masks and shoes.
I've worn anywhere from football cleats to try to basically grip the bottom to run a little faster, to construction boots, to deck boots, to scuba boots.
I use no tools. The only thing I got a knife and cut it off. That's it. Knife.
They plunge as low as 60 feet deep to find the sponges.
Hardly ever it will go over 45, 50, 60 feet maybe.
They walk along the bottom for as long as it takes to fill up one bag.
I just keep looking. I just make a lot of dives. I go down and I look.
In the old days, they used a hook to tear sponges from the bottom. But now, by law, a diver has to cut the sponge with a knife to promote regeneration. One study shows cut sponges have a much better chance of surviving, roughly 30% higher than hooked ones. It's kind of like shearing a sheep or cutting a branch off a tree. Sponges actually show the highest regenerative ability of any animal. Still, Captain Tasso doesn't harvest the smaller ones. He leaves them behind so they can keep growing.
They have to be 5 inches and up.
They haul their full net up to the boat and make their way back to shore.
Eh?
On the docks, Tasso and his team get to work, separating and cleaning the sponges.
The price of the sponges depends on the size of the sponges and the quality.
Wool sponges are the most valuable, going for about $15 each. They're the softest and they hold a lot of water. Yellows are more coarse. They're also the cheapest. As the fishermen sort the sponges, they give them the first of many cleanings. Then they trim them to get rid of any discolorations and to shape them.
That's the reason I'm wearing the gloves, because sponges like a fine sandpaper. They wear you out, you know, the fingerprints disappear. See? Just like glass. I almost dropped my coffee cup this morning, you know?
Overnight, Captain Tasso leaves his clean sponges out to dry. Some people stop by to ask questions or buy straight from the harvesters on the docks. But Tasso says the best option is finding a wholesale buyer. The sponges find themselves, or rather a piece of themselves, at a processing plant, like this one, about 1.5 miles from the docks. Sponges get soaked in the wetting area and pushed down into a bath with a wooden paddle. Then they're drained in this net and transferred to a water extractor, where they're spun to remove excess water, leaving the sponges damp and ready for the next stage, cutting. The worker protects his fingers from this sharp wire with gloves.
These are sponges that are netted up for processing. We'll put them in the bath tonight and they'll sit there overnight and then be processed from there.
Harry Barber manages the plant at Armley Sponge Company. The Armley family founded the company in the Bahamas in 1908 and expanded into Florida about 50 years ago. They opened their Tarpon Springs processing plant in 2018. Into the washing machine they go. Next, time to dry and get sorted by size. They box the sponges and prepare them for shipment.
Bath sponges have taken off tremendously because people want to use something on their children that's sustainable and, you know, clean and natural.
Despite the sponge's near magical ability to regenerate, it was almost wiped out here in the late 1930s by a mysterious disease. And then again in the 40s and 50s, out-of-control algae called red tides killed many local sponge beds. The population survived against all odds and thrived during the industry's heyday in the 1980s, when around 30 sponge boats and 50 divers docked here every day.
It was a blight of sponges in the Mediterranean, and we were able to harvest here locally at higher prices and ship stuff over to the Mediterranean.
But when the Mediterranean fisheries recovered, the demand and the price went down again in Tarpon Springs. Many fishermen went out of business, but some, like Captain Tasso, stuck it out.
And I don't know how to do anything else.
2022 hasn't proven much easier. With record inflation and fuel prices, maintaining and gassing up a boat is expensive. And the industry is facing another problem. Hurricanes are happening more and more because of the climate crisis, so bad years are becoming the norm. Divers can't go out during storms, but there's something else. Even though sponges are technically animals, they survive by attaching themselves to the ocean floor. During a hurricane, many get smothered by sand or hit by tumbling rocks and die. Lately, only a handful of sponge boats and about a dozen divers go out any given day.
You just have to look harder because it's not everywhere general like used to be. A red tide kill them, but some survivors here and there.
Captain Tasso works long days.
I work all my life. I grew up in a family, 12 kids. My father take me up 4 o'clock in the morning, working all day long. I can work 24 hours non-stop.
Handling his sponges the whole time.
From the time you pick the sponge on the bottom, that's the first time you touch it. By the time you sell it, you have touched the same sponge at least 20 more times.
Armley mostly buys from independent contractors like Tasso.
We purchase from them based on what they bring in, and the conditions and sizes of what they have.
So the income isn't guaranteed. Sponger Muhip Goktepe goes on these long fishing trips year-round. He makes about $46,000 a year.
If you bring sponges, it's gonna be good year. You don't bring him, no good year. Sometimes hurricane, tropical storm, you don't work.
Some years you work more and you make more. Some years less and you make less. Depends how much time you're going out there, that's all.
In addition to the financial uncertainty, diving can be dangerous if your hose gets cut or you dive too deep. That's why Muhip and Tasso aren't trying to pass down a family business.
Well, cut my air hose a couple of times and I ran out of air and I have to swim up. That's a dangerous stuff.
I don't want my kids or my grandkids to do this job. They can do better, you know what I mean?
There's not much money into it. Nobody wants to go get beat up out there for 20 days. People prefer to be in the land. I ain't gonna push my grandkids to this job. I don't want them to do that. They're doing good in the school.
It is sad to see so few fishing, but I certainly understand it. The markets right now won't bear really high prices to offset the cost of fuel. Maintenance on boats is expensive. We're looking at a country and a world that's trying to look at natural products.
So until the industry can rejuvenate itself, Tarpon Springs will have to rely on its tourism. Visitors pour tens of millions of dollars into the community every year, eating authentic Greek food and taking boat tours. They also shop for sponge souvenirs to take home. But many locals wonder if tourism will be the long-term solution, and if it's not, what's next for the upcoming generation of spongers? This grain has been nicknamed the gold of the Andes. Most of it comes from Peru, where around 100,000 tons are produced every year. The popularity of quinoa exploded over the past decade, transforming the fortunes of farmers who have been harvesting it for generations.
Y quizás muchas familias también han hecho estudiar a sus hijos en una universidad, ¿no? Una universidad o un tecnológico, gracias a que este cultivo tiene un valor.
Unfortunately, those good years may be coming to an end. Other countries have increased quinoa production, driving down prices, and shifting weather patterns are threatening yields. But quinoa is a superfood with more than 3,000 varieties, even though you'll only find a handful of them at the supermarket. So can the people who brought their staple food to the world help it adapt to an uncertain future? People across the Andes have been eating quinoa way before it hit the shelves at gourmet markets.
Nuestros abuelos, bisabuelos, siempre nos han enseñado a que este alimento deben comerlo primero, ¿no? Porque es lo que les va a ayudar más adelante para que cuando seamos abuelos pues no estemos también enfermándonos de la salud, de todas esas cosas, ¿no?
For centuries, Peruvians have ground the grain to make flour and ferment chicha, a popular drink. Quinoa was sacred to the Inca, who called it the mother grain. That's because it grew well under harsh conditions and flourished in areas where other crops struggled. The grain has adapted as weather patterns have changed in recent years, but growing it is still a struggle.
Nos ha empezado un poco a rotar el tiempo de cosecha, ¿no? El tiempo de siembra ya no es en el mismo tiempo, ¿no?
Ignacio is one of around 68,000 quinoa producers in Peru. He's been out in the fields with his family since he was just 10 years old.
Yo era menor de edad todavía, no podía trabajar así como al nivel que trabajo ahora, ¿no? Y tampoco poco a poco iba entendiendo, ¿no? Cómo se hacía el sembrío, todo, ¿no?
The season to plant quinoa starts at the end of the summer. Workers gather early in the morning, and they pass around handfuls of coca leaves. Then they call to Pachamama, or Mother Earth, to help them get the job done quickly. Ignacio says the plant acts as a mild stimulant that gives them strength. Ignacio and his family sow the seeds after the soil has been harrowed and fertilized. About 7 months later, they harvest the crop by hand.
Y se pone a secar al sol. Como está lloviendo ahorita, el grano está húmedo. Y cuando está húmedo, si lo colocamos, tiende a honguearse.
Then they cut the branches and remove the edible parts of the grain.
El trabajo de la cosecha de la quinoa es cansado, sí, es cansado.
They shake the grain to remove any leftover dirt, and then transfer the quinoa to a small warehouse.
Gracias al apoyo que tengo de mis hermanos, de mis padres, entre todos hemos ido trabajando un poco más.
Listo para la planta.
About a decade ago, Ignacio and his family would have traveled across the country to sell their quinoa.
Nosotros teníamos que llevarlo a otro lugar, ¿no? Al mercado local, llevar quizás hasta Juliaca, hasta Puno, ¿no? Para poder venderlo. Cosa que hacía un trabajo de más, ¿no?
But that's now the job of Copacabana, a cooperative that represents more than 600 farmers in southern Peru.
De ahí fue la iniciativa para poder nosotros como productores unirnos, ¿no? Hacer un equipo, en formar una alianza con unos productores de otras zonas también.
Representatives from cooperatives like Eusebio visit the farms to inspect the grains. The cooperatives pay farmers like Ignacio about $1.50 per kilo.
Le damos asistencia técnica, le facilitamos con maquinaria, le facilitamos con insumos, ¿no? Para que tengan. Sin embargo, no les regalamos, sino también es al costo del productor.
About 1,200 tons of quinoa are processed every year at the cooperative's facilities. Once the quinoa reaches their warehouse, workers thoroughly wash it twice to remove a bitter chemical called saponin.
Porque si no se hace un buen lavado, entonces tiene cierto amargor la quinoa.
They split the quinoa into categories, remove any impurities, and then package it. It'll make its way overseas. The cooperative says it exports to the US, the European Union, and Japan. In the US, the product has become increasingly popular. America imports about a third of all the world's quinoa. But it wasn't always this way. Quinoa used to be mostly unknown outside of the Andes.
El precio era muy barato. La gente no quería quinoa.
But it all began to change in 2009, when the Peruvian government started establishing free trade agreements. It became easier for companies to export to the US and beyond. Over the next few years, commerce between Peru and the US reportedly boomed. Word spread about the nutritious superfood that was gluten-free and high in protein.
This was when stuff like the keto diet were taking off, and there was this conventional wisdom that, hey, look, among all of those grains that you can be eating, quinoa probably packs the strongest punch in terms of protein.
The United Nations even declared 2013 the International Year of Quinoa to celebrate the ancestral practices of the Andean people.
Basically, shining a big, bright spotlight on quinoa as something that people should consume for their health, and that really led to the whole thing.
The average price of quinoa in Peru almost doubled between 2012 and 2014. And it wasn't just producers who benefited. The rise in quinoa sales helped locals who didn't even work with the crop.
There was probably some kind of trickle-down effect in the economy where the quinoa price rise led to the people who were selling it being significantly better off and spending some of those funds on the economy.
In 2011, almost 80% of the country's quinoa was produced in the region of Puno. But farmers in other parts of the country tried to cash in too. Some reportedly relied on chemical fertilizers to cultivate the grain. In 2014, Peru set a record for quinoa production. But trouble lay ahead for Peruvian farmers. For centuries, the grain had mostly been harvested in the Andes because it thrives in high altitudes. But quinoa farmers started popping up in other parts of the world.
Hemos visto que en los últimos años se ha ido produciendo bastante quinoa en todos los lugares, no simplemente acá en Perú.
I think globalization is a double-edged sword in a case like this. These households can benefit from the global demand for that product, but it also means that it has really pushed other regions of the globe to experiment with growing quinoa themselves.
The market was flooded with quinoa. That caused prices to plunge by the end of 2015. Farmers in Peru reportedly began to struggle, and some had to sell livestock to survive. Others held on to their quinoa, hoping that prices would rise again. But by 2020, the price of quinoa in Peru had dropped to about half of its 2014 high. Meanwhile, farmers in Peru are producing more quinoa than ever. But the types sold in supermarkets represent just a fraction of the 3,000 varieties that can be harvested here.
Siempre es bueno sembrar la quinoa, no simplemente en un color nomás, ¿no? Sino en los tres colores, en roja, en negra y en quinoa blanca también, ¿no? Porque al final lo que vendemos pues son los tres colores.
Farmers would traditionally cultivate different types of quinoa to make sure that at least some thrived if weather conditions were harsh. But some have abandoned this practice to focus on the most lucrative strains. And experts worry this may mean losing many varieties of the ancient crop.
Sí sería malo perder esta gran variabilidad que tenemos, puesto que sabemos que algunas tienen algunos compuestos que no todas presentan.
That's why many are brought here, to the National Institute of Agricultural Innovation.
Los agricultores normalmente mantienen la semilla porque el cultivo de quinoa es un cultivo milenario. Entonces ellos han mantenido la semilla, nosotros como INIA hemos colectado esa semilla y ahora la mantenemos almacenada en los bancos. Acá en el Perú más o menos como banco almacenamos cerca de 17 variedades.
Some of those less common strains could have uses beyond food.
Hemos visto que ese contenido esas saponinas pueden ser de utilidad para la industria, bien sea para el desarrollo de fármacos o para la industria de los detergentes. Los agricultores también podrían estar sacando una ganancia produciendo específicamente esta gran diversidad que contenemos.
Ignacio says he would eventually like to sell baked goods, like cookies, made of quinoa. But for now, he has to focus on what sells. There's a bustling operation behind the fancy cameras of food commercials. It takes dozens of people and a few customized robots to make a burger look this juicy.
Oh, nothing here is simple. As far as the work we do, it's incredibly complex, very technical.
Steve Geralt has filmed commercials for big brands like Hershey's, Heinz, and Pepsi through his production company, The Garage. And there's a lot of money on the line. Filming one 30-second ad can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're working against the clock because they use real food, which doesn't stay pretty for long.
That's the misnomer about everything. Faking makes things harder.
We visited Steve's studio in Brooklyn, New York, to see how his team films the perfect burger. Today, Steve and his team are working on a test shoot for Burger King. They'll use it to try and land the client.
Yeah, good.
Brett Kurtzwale is a veteran food stylist. It's his job to make the burger look like a Whopper. He usually has a budget of a couple $1,000s, and he always buys a lot more than he'll use, so he can pick out the perfect-looking bun, patty, and veggies. Then he gets to work, but he doesn't cook the meat all the way through.
Because I didn't want it to shrink too much. I wanted to get as much volume out of this piece of meat as I could get.
Even perfect patties need final touches, so he uses a colorant made of gravy darkener and soap to add a charred look. He only has to paint half the burger because the camera films from just one side. A mixture of Vaseline and pulverized meat helps fill in any holes. And those grill marks? Another trick of the trade. Brett heats up metal skewers and then...
I just pushed into the burger with the hot metal and it seared.
Next, he melts the cheese using a clothes steamer.
How did you change it to make it burger?
I just said, you're for food. But I'm trying to control how much comes out, so I've covered up some of the holes.
He cuts the onions and tomatoes on a slant, so they lie flatter.
I think you would have been a really good surgeon in another life.
Well, yeah, my mother would have been happier.
Some other tricks? Denture cream to hold up ingredients.
For condensation on cans, we'll use glycerin.
Yeah, not that much. Too far.
While Brett finishes up, Steve's team is making sure everything is ready on set. The trickiest part is combining what the client wants in the commercial with what's technologically possible.
They have no idea about engineering. Yeah, they're just like, robots are cool. We want a robot.
But since today he's working on a test shoot, he just has to implement his own vision.
I'll be one of those people that wears the protection.
Then he turns to master rigger Matthew Huber. He says half the time he has to build the rigs completely from scratch. They provide the structure for the specialized equipment that makes food dance across the screen. His work goes hand in hand with the robots.
The robot obviously is a hugely complicated and expensive thing that's used for a lot of what we do. But if you only just need a straight line movement pulling back, it's easier to set up a simple machine that just does a single type of movement.
Like these air pistons he uses to launch food. Or these catapults. To save on buying new parts, he uses a lot of the same base pieces.
It's like Legos, you just put stuff together, take it apart, do something different with it the next time. So we've used a lot of these pieces probably hundreds of times.
Meanwhile, Paula Andreas Ramirez is finalizing the set, from the tables to the ketchup bottles off to the side.
I want it to feel real. So if it's blank, it won't feel like it's a real commercial kitchen.
Every inch visible to the camera matters. So Paula's team built this tile wall just for this shoot. But they said it still felt empty.
So we just added these 2 floating shelves up there. We plan for something and then we just have to be ready for the unexpected.
Her typical props budget is $40,000 a shoot, but she can pull a lot from her personal collection.
This has been 20 years of collecting. And this is like Salvation Army, garage sales, years and years of hoarding. I always like to have extra. So if you're shooting, an example, a glass of soda, I need to have at least 6 of the same glasses for quick changes, if they're scratched, because it's video. So it's a little bit, one breaks, exactly.
So when that burger arrives, it's game time.
I gotta go on set.
Yay, burger!
Now it's a race against the clock.
Get the tomatoes to crunch.
Angle feels right.
Can we melt the cheese a little more? Maybe get a little heat in there. Go ahead and roll camera.
And push in a little bit closer.
All right, good.
Today they have custom-built water-cooled lights that don't torch the food.
We used to have these really hot lights that would cook the food and it would die really quickly, so the ice cream would be impossible to shoot in slow motion because it would just melt the second you turn the lights on.
But that lettuce will start to wilt in a matter of minutes. Hot lights are not. So quick-moving robots and tons of planning are essential to keep a shoot on schedule, because any delay could mean running over budget. The first action uses a dolly zoom to create something known as the Hitchcock effect.
But the whole background is warping around it.
Cue the robots. They're actually the same kind that build cars. This robot cost $150,000. And it can pretty much do any move you can think of.
Sometimes you could program the robot pretty quickly. Some moves take a whole day.
Here's the second shot. Steve envisioned the camera moving through a field of burgers as each gets pulled out of frame.
We're probably only 1.5 inches away from that burger when we land. So to try to do that with people would be almost impossible. It's a really complex move that the robots do really easily, and they do it the same exact way every time.
But speed is not the only challenge. Every shot has to be identical. If a burger is even a centimeter off, or if something on set gets bumped between takes, they might have to start over.
These fries don't want to behave.
This laser helps them keep track of the burger's position.
Or sometimes you might do a job where there's 100 takes of the same move, and that would be a nightmare.
They also have to be really flexible on set.
There's always curveballs that happen because it's a lot of problem solving, which I love.
For the last shot, Steve ties all the ingredients on a fishing wire, and a robot slices the string and the camera catches the perfect drop. This exact move was actually Steve's claim to fame in 2016.
I did this famous burger drop video that went viral all over the internet.
He slowly raked in millions of views across platforms, and global publications started covering his work. All that social media buzz earned him a lot of viewers and new clients. And he was able to launch The Garage in 2019.
The burger drop was kind of like the spark that started the path towards where we are today. And now TikTok is crazier than Instagram ever was for me.
Steve is a former food photographer, but he wanted to combine his love of engineering, food, and video.
And amazingly, there's a job that lets me do that. There's a lot of different jobs that my guidance counselor did not tell me about, including my own.
Today, his team films 40 advertisements a year, billing over $5 million annually.
kind of feels like CGI, but it's actually done in camera. And I think to accomplish that like larger than life feeling takes just a lot of technology and skill.
Steve says they know they've done a good job when viewers can't tell a whole production is hidden behind a shot.
They have no idea what we do at the end of the day. It is fun for me for people to understand how complex this stuff is.
But all that complexity is worth it, because there's a lot of money on the line. Fast food companies poured $5 billion into advertising in 2019, and for good reason. They know just how valuable the power of food suggestion can be. A Yale University study found that visual cues like food ads can have an effect on food cravings. Another study showed visual cues can influence overeating and even weight gain, and that can convert into traffic and impressions for a brand.
You're responsible for a lot of people breaking their diet.
Yeah, me included.
These brands led the pack in ad spending in 2019, and budgets just keep ballooning. In September, Burger King announced it'll invest $400 million in restaurant renovations and advertising, a 30% increase from 2021. Which is why Steve and his team filmed this Whopper pitch, hoping to hook a new client with their dancing robots and juicy burgers. Nearly every lime Americans eat comes from Mexico. But lime prices spiked to almost $4 in early 2022, and stores had trouble keeping their shelves stocked. Droughts, extreme heat, and disease have hit farms across Mexico.
La planta de limón es muy sensible al tema del clima. Siempre que hay cambios bruscos en el clima o fenómenos climáticos, siempre nos generan un estrés en la planta.
Farmers in the state of Veracruz are holding on. This producer has done it by growing their limes on orange trees. We visited one farm to see how workers grow, pick, and process millions of limes in the face of an increasingly unpredictable environment. About 45 lime producers are spread across Martínez de la Torre, Veracruz. They grow Persian limes, the seedless kind.
Algo muy importante porque se utiliza en la mayoría de los platillos.
Persian limes love the wet climate here.
La verdad es que estamos en una zona tropical, con bastante calor.
But in recent years, the area has faced increasingly extreme weather. So how then do they grow strong enough lime trees even without seeds? Well, believe it or not, they start with orange seeds. They take a mature orange stalk and a bud from a lime plant and use a grafting technique to combine them.
Literalmente se pega esa yema a la planta, se hace una venda con un nylon.
While it grows, workers cut away any leaves that aren't lime, basically convincing this orange plant that it's a lime one. Orange rootstocks like this are hardier, so when it's mature, the fusion lime plant will better stand up to diseases and climate change. After about a year,
esta planta ya está lista para salir a campo y ser sembrada. Cuando ya tiene a partir de 2, o en este caso ya 3 ramitas, ya está.
But the hard work doesn't stop there.
Yo considero que son las plagas y las enfermedades, que es lo que tenemos que estar constantemente monitoreando.
In 2014, lime farms across Mexico saw a huge drop in production because of a plant-killing disease called HLB, or citrus greening. Insects transmit a type of bacteria that starves the trees of nutrients, causing it to produce less fruit. So how did they keep producing millions of limes with these insects on the loose? Well, teams here discovered they could control HLB and a disease called wood pocket using mesh netting and insecticide.
Pues sería rápidamente monitorear todas las plantas, asegurarnos que hay presencia como tal en la planta y realizar aplicaciones. Pues es de suma importancia porque ahora sí esto es lo que nos garantiza tener una planta segura al momento de llevarla al campo.
It takes about 4 years for the tree to bear fruit. One tree can produce about 150 pounds of limes per year. This picker has been harvesting here for 2 years. Like him, most everyone working on the farm is from the state.
Ya lo que está más grandes y se ve que está tiernitos pues.
But in the last 5 years, limes haven't always looked like this. Veracruz farmers have faced a growing number of floods, freezes, and high winds.
La planta de limón es muy sensible al tema del clima.
In very dry conditions, the lime skin is too smooth and may turn yellow. If conditions are too wet, the tree will drown, causing the fruit's peel to split. When it's really windy, branches hit the fruit.
Le hacen como una herida y después esa herida cicatriza formando estas lacras.
This extreme weather was part of what caused a lime shortage that began in 2021, driving prices up 300% by January 2022.
Es un cultivo muy sensible, el cual nos requiere mucha atención, ¿sí? Constantemente, y eso implica hacer ajustes en el plan de trabajo agronómico de acuerdo a ciertos fenómenos que pudieran llegarse a presentar.
Still, Veracruz has been spared the worst of these shifting weather patterns. Farmers here hope that grafting will be their tree's lifeline, if that time does come. In the fields, workers tug off ripe limes and drop them into these traditional ayate bags, woven from agave leaves. Workers can harvest about 2,000 limes in a day. They load them onto trucks headed to the packaging facility.
Empezamos nuestro proceso con el área de vaciado.
This machine dumps limes onto the processing line. Each one gets washed with a detergent disinfectant.
Para retirar cualquier tipo de suciedad, polvo que pueda traer de campo la fruta.
And hit with a spray of palm wax. It's not just to make the limes look shiny.
Fruta es para poner como una capa sobre la fruta que le va a ayudar a su vida de anaquel o a que la fruta tenga una mayor vida, pues que no se deshidrate y que no se madure tan pronto.
Throughout their journey in the factory, the limes will get sorted multiple times. Some stations do it by hand, others with fancy tech.
Nuestra máquina consta de un sistema operativo el cual toma de 20 a 40 fotos a cada fruta que va pasando.
Using those pictures, the machine separated them based on their size. Ones that aren't the right size will go directly to Mexico's juicing industry. The perfectly sized ones will head on to get exported. But first, there's quality control.
Este limón es para exportación a Estados Unidos. Tenemos un limón con una buena cáscara, un buen color, un color uniforme y si lo partimos o lo abrimos, tenemos una buena cantidad de jugo.
After they pass this final test, the limes are ready for packaging and shipping. The majority of the limes produced in this region end up in the United States. Demand for limes has been increasing for decades as Latin American and Asian cuisines became more popular. But in 1994, after a new free trade agreement went into effect, the floodgates for Mexican limes opened. Now, the US is the biggest importer of limes globally, doubling the amount it purchased from Mexico in the last 10 years. To keep up with demand, Mexico increased its production 50% in the same decade. Workers here say that demand is a double-edged sword. On one hand,
el limón es el sustento de miles de hogares, de muchas personas, de muchas empresas y de importación, de exportación de materias primas, fertilizantes. Entonces, esto da comida a muchísima gente.
But the downside, extreme weather is making it hard to keep up.
Cada vez hay calores más fuertes y se nota cada vez más la falta de lluvia.
The farm can also lean on that grafting technique to help grow trees faster, so they can keep up with booming US interest. But while they wait for what might come, they'll keep picking away, hoping for steady weather and a strong harvest.
Sí, porque esto nos da muchísimo trabajo a todos nosotros y la verdad nos sentimos muy orgullosos de que ustedes consuman el limón veracruzano y el limón mexicano.